Welcome back, legends. You're at The Fiction Wizard. Another incredible story awaits. Molly Weasley arrived at Privet Drive with 5 children and a warrant. She left with 6. Subscribe and hit the bell. Let's dive right in. Chapter 1. The Warrant. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which Molly Weasley would later think was entirely appropriate. Tuesdays were the sort of day that didn't warn you. They didn't have the dramatic weight of Mondays or the relieved looseness of Fridays. They just showed up, ordinary and unsuspecting, and dropped things in your lap. She was at the kitchen table when the owl came, not one of their own, not Errol's familiar lurching silhouette, but a clean, precise tawny owl with a Hogwarts seal on the letter it carried. It landed on the windowsill above the washing-up basin with a kind of deliberate patience that told her, before she'd even broken the wax, that whatever was inside wasn't casual correspondence. Ginny was eating toast at the other end of the table. Ron was somewhere upstairs, still asleep at 8:30 because it was summer and he had the sleeping habits of a particularly lazy garden slug. Fred and George were in the garden doing something with a gnome that Molly had already decided she didn't want to know about. Percy was at his desk in his room, almost certainly reorganizing something that didn't need reorganizing. The house was loud in that low, familiar way it always was. Pots clanging themselves clean. A radio muttering the wizarding wireless network in the sitting room. The clock on the wall ticking steadily, all 9 hands clustered around home in that way that always made her feel, despite everything, that the world was basically all right. She opened the letter. She read it once, quickly. Then she set it flat on the table, smoothed it with both palms, and read it again slowly, the way you read something when you need to be absolutely certain your eyes haven't made a terrible mistake. They hadn't. Dear Molly, I write to you not in my capacity as headmaster, but as a man who has been carrying a concern for some time now and has, I'm afraid, allowed caution to override conscience. I intend to correct that today. The trace on young Harry Potter's magic, standard monitoring for underage witches and wizards, returned an anomalous reading this past fortnight. Not an accidental use of magic, which I would expect and which I could account for, but an extended suppression of magical activity consistent with extreme emotional distress and, the monitoring suggests, physical confinement. I have made inquiries through channels I considered discreet. What I have learned has disturbed me considerably. I am writing to you because I believe you are the person best suited to act on this information, and because I trust you to act on it in the right way. The address is number 4, Privet Drive, Little Whinging, Surrey. There is a legal instrument you may wish to research, a wizarding child welfare warrant, last commonly used in 1947. Percy will know where to find the relevant statutes. I have enclosed a letter of support from my office, should it be needed. I am sorry I did not write sooner. Albus Dumbledore. Ginny said, Mum? You've gone very still. Molly looked up. She was aware, distantly, that her hands were perfectly flat on the table. Not shaking. Just very, very still. Finish your toast, she said. Her voice came out calm. That surprised her. Inside, something was happening that wasn't calm at all. It was something that had claws, and it was pacing, and it had Harry Potter's name on it. She stood up, folded the letter with the same careful deliberateness she used when handling something fragile, and walked to the foot of the stairs. Percy, she called. Come down here, please. Percy appeared at the top of the stairs within 30 seconds, already dressed, because of course he was. He had his head boy badge on even though it was summer, even though school hadn't started, and normally Molly would have found that endearing in its predictability. Right now she didn't notice. He started. Sit down, she said. Read this. She handed him the letter and watched his face as he read it. Percy's expressions were always careful, considered, as though he'd decided early in life that his face was a document that required proofreading before submission. But she saw something move under the surface as he got to the middle of the letter. Something young and startled. Child welfare warrant, he said, looking up. Can it be done? Percy was quiet for exactly 4 seconds. Molly knew Percy's silences. That one was him cataloging, pulling at threads in his very organized mental library. I'd need to check the statutes. There's a whole section of the Magical Jurisprudence Compendium, 1962 edition, Dad has it somewhere, that covers welfare instruments. They fell out of use after the ministry established its own child services department in 1951, but they were never formally repealed. He paused. If the grounds are sufficient, the grounds, Molly said quietly, are sufficient. Something about how she said it made Percy stop asking questions. He looked at her for a moment, then nodded. I'll find the statutes. You have an hour. Percy blinked. An hour? I'd like to leave by 10. He went back up the stairs at a pace that was nearly running. Nearly. Percy Weasley did not run. But he moved with an urgency she hadn't seen from him since his OWLs. Molly stood in the kitchen for a moment after he'd gone. The radio was still murmuring. A pot had finished washing itself and was stacking neatly in the rack. Ginny was watching her with those sharp brown eyes that didn't miss much and never had. Is Harry all right? Ginny asked. And Molly, who had been holding herself together with both hands since she'd read Physical Confinement, looked at her daughter and said, he will be. She started planning. She went outside first. Fred had the gnome by one ankle and was spinning it with the lazy confidence of someone who'd done this thousands of times. George was sitting on the fence watching with his arms crossed, offering commentary. Bit more to the left, no, your left, Fred, Molly said. The gnome went sailing at a non-optimal angle. Fred turned, brushing his hands on his jeans. He looked at her face and his grin settled into something more attentive. What's happened? We're going to get Harry today, she said. George was off the fence before she'd finished the sentence. Not grinning, not performing, just there, feet on the ground, looking at her steadily. Is he all right? I don't know yet. She looked at both of them. I need you to not cause trouble today. The twins exchanged a glance that she'd spent 12 years learning to read. This one said, we'll decide that when we get there. Fred. George. We'll be good, Mum, Fred said. Not promise. Not of course. Just will be good, which from Fred was the most serious version of that sentence. She nodded. Get cleaned up. We leave at 10. She went back inside, passed through the kitchen, and climbed the stairs to Ron's room. She knocked once and opened the door without waiting. Ron was a tremendous lump under a Chudley Cannon's duvet, one arm hanging off the bed, snoring with a dedication that suggested he was nowhere near waking. Ron, she said, and when he didn't stir, Ronald. He came awake with the particular flailing panic of someone who'd been taught by experience that their mother using their full name was not a peaceful way to begin the day. He sat up, hair going in 7 directions, squinting. What? What, is there a spider? We're going to get Harry, she said. The duvet went back. Ron was out of bed and looking for his jeans before his eyes were fully open. While Percy worked, and he worked with an intensity that she felt even through the ceiling, Molly began assembling what she needed. She moved through the burrow with purpose, collecting things in a basket, Dumbledore's letter, a fresh roll of parchment, 2 quick quotes quills, a small sealed envelope that held the headmaster's letter of support, and 3 separate copies of Clause 47b of the Caretaking and Custodial Rights Act 1892, which she happened to have on hand because she'd done her own reading 3 days ago when she'd first started to worry. She'd been worrying, she realized, for longer than she'd admitted to herself. Little things that hadn't added up. Harry's letters to Ron, she'd read them when Ron left them lying about, because she was a mother and that was what mothers did, were too short, too carefully cheerful. He never mentioned meals. He never mentioned doing anything. He wrote about looking forward to school the way other children wrote about Christmas, with a desperation dressed up as casual mention that he'd learned at some point not to show too plainly. She'd told herself, children are resilient. She'd told herself, Dumbledore has his reasons. She'd told herself, it's not your place. She was done telling herself that. Percy came downstairs at 9:47 with a sheaf of parchment covered in his very small, very neat handwriting and a look on his face that she recognized as his cautiously triumphant expression. The one he got when he'd found a loophole or solved a problem that had seemed unsolvable. "All right," he said, sitting at the table and spreading the parchment. A Wizarding Child Welfare Warrant was introduced under the Magical Family Statutes of 1887, revised 1921, and is issued under the authority of a ministry official or, and this is the important bit, under the countersignature of the headmaster of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, who is considered a designated officer of magical child welfare by the Educational Amendment of 1935. Since Dumbledore has provided a letter of support, can it compel a handover? Molly asked. Yes. Percy straightened the parchment unnecessarily. Under Clause 14, a welfare warrant grants the named individual temporary emergency custodial responsibility and compels any current custodian to cooperate with the transfer. Failure to cooperate constitutes obstruction of magical law. He paused. The Dursleys are Muggles, which complicates. Does it invalidate the warrant? Percy shook his head. No. Magical law has jurisdiction over the care of any magical person regardless of the custodian's status. There's a precedent from 1943, a case where a half-blood which was placed with Muggle relatives who, it's not pleasant reading. But the warrant was upheld. Molly sat down across from him. What do I need to sign? Percy had already drafted it. Of course he had. He slid the parchment across and she read through it carefully, because this mattered and she was not going to make a mistake. It was thorough and precise and exactly what she needed. She pulled out her wand and signed with a quick, clean stroke of magic that left her signature glowing briefly on the page. I've also drafted a secondary declaration, Percy said, sliding another page across, citing the trace monitoring anomaly as evidence of welfare concern, which strengthens the evidentiary basis of the warrant and, Percy, she said, and he stopped. She looked at him properly. This is excellent work. He flushed slightly, the way he always did when she said that, the small 17-year-old boy briefly visible under the head boy exterior. Right. Well. Yes. Come on then, she said. Are you all changed? I've been changed since 7. Of course you have. The Ford Anglia was Arthur's project, his pride, his slightly embarrassing and completely wonderful magical secret, and Molly had borrowed it before Arthur left for work that morning with nothing more than, I need the car today, there's something I need to see to. Arthur had looked at her face and handed over the keys without asking a single question, which was one of the 10,000 reasons she loved him absolutely. She'd modified the interior herself over the years. The undetectable extension charm wasn't something she'd done once and left, she'd layered it, refined it, until the interior of the Ford Anglia could comfortably seat 12 if necessary and had a back section that was, depending on what the family needed, anything from a large comfortable seating area to a small camping setup. Right now it was configured for 6, with proper seats and, along the sides, a pair of long bench seats that Fred and George had immediately claimed. Ron was in the middle back seat. Ginny was next to him, quiet, watching the Burrow get smaller out the back window. Percy was in the front with Molly, the parchment folded in his breast pocket, sitting very straight. Fred leaned forward from the bench seat. So what exactly is the plan when we get there? I present the warrant, Molly said. They comply. And if they don't? They will. But if, Frederick Gideon Weasley, she said pleasantly, if you ask me that question again I will turn this car around. Fred sat back. There was a beat of silence. She won't, though, George murmured. Obviously not, Fred agreed. But still. The car lifted smoothly off the lane behind the Burrow, invisible to Muggle eyes, and turned south. It was an hour and 40 minutes to Little Whinging, and they mostly made it in silence, the kind of silence that was full rather than empty. Molly drove with both hands on the wheel and her mind on what was ahead. She'd been rehearsing since she'd read the letter, not a speech, exactly, because she didn't intend to make speeches. Just the shape of it. The legal ground she stood on. The warrant in Percy's pocket. The look she was going to use. Arthur sometimes called it the look. Capital letters, slightly said with affection and fear in equal measure. She'd never tried to explain it. It wasn't a thing you explained, it was a thing you had. She'd had it since Bill was born. It came with the territory. She was going to need it today. Ron was the one who broke the silence, about 40 minutes out. He'd been staring out the window, watching the motorway below, and he said without quite looking at anyone, he had a cupboard, you know. At his house. He mentioned it once, sort of accidentally, and then went funny and changed the subject. I didn't, I thought he meant like a walk-in wardrobe or something. Nobody said anything. He went funny, Ron said again, quietly, more to himself than anyone. About a cupboard. Ron, Ginny said. Yeah. Stop, or I'll cry and then you'll cry and it'll be horrible. Ron rubbed his face. Right. Yeah. George was looking out the far window, his jaw set in a line she rarely saw on him. He looked, just briefly, like his father. Like Arthur when something had genuinely made him angry, which was rare enough that it always struck her hard when she saw it. Fred was very quiet. She watched them in the rearview mirror, her children, her loud and chaotic and enormous-hearted children, processing something they didn't quite have words for, and she thought, this is why. This is why the world can't just leave things alone and tell themselves someone else will see to it. Someone had to see to it. She was going to see to it. Little Whinging was precisely what she'd expected, which was to say it was the kind of place that had been specifically designed to look like everything was fine. Broad streets. Clean gutters. Front gardens with roses that were maybe a little too symmetrical. Houses that were all similar enough to suggest a shared, unspoken agreement about what normal looked like and what they thought of anything that didn't fit. Number 4 was like the others. Beige cream front, a car in the drive that was extremely new and extremely clean, roses along the front path, net curtains in the front window that shifted slightly as the Ford Anglia, visible now. Molly had dropped the concealment when they pulled into the street, because she was not arriving invisibly, pulled up to the curb. Nice house, Fred said, looking at it. Horrible, George said. They weren't wrong, either of them. It was a nice house. It was horrible. Right, Molly said. She turned off the engine. Everyone listen to me. I will handle this. Percy is my legal support. The rest of you are to stay here unless I ask for you. Mum, Fred started. I mean it. She looked at each of them in the mirror, then turned to Percy. Come on. She got out of the car. The sun was already warm at 10:30, a flat suburban summer sun that made everything look a bit overexposed. She was wearing ordinary clothes, muggle passing, she'd thought about it, a floral blouse and sensible trousers. Her wand was in her pocket. The warrant was in Percy's. She walked up the front path and knocked on the door. The woman who answered was thin and horse-faced with a long neck and eyes that were slightly too close together, and Molly recognized her from Dumbledore's description and from the way her face went entirely rigid at the sight of two people she didn't know on her doorstep at 10:30 on a Tuesday morning. Mrs. Dursley, Molly said. Petunia Dursley's eyes went from Molly to Percy, and Molly could see her doing the calculation, neighbors? Charity? And then Petunia looked at Percy's red hair and Molly's wand-shaped pocket and her face went a color that wasn't quite white but was heading there. She stopped. Molly Weasley, Molly said. This is my son Percy. May we come in? Petunia's hand tightened on the door. This isn't, Mrs. Dursley. Molly didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. We can speak on the doorstep if you prefer, but I'd have thought you'd want the neighbors not to hear this particular conversation. Petunia looked at the street. Then she stepped back and let them in. The inside of number 4, Privet Drive was aggressively normal. Everything was in its place. Everything was very clean. There were photos on the walls, many, many photos of a large blonde boy at various stages of childhood, one sitting, one at a theme park, one in some kind of uniform, and a complete and conspicuous absence of photos of anyone else. Molly noticed the absence. She catalogued it with the same quiet, careful attention she gave everything, and added it to the weight she was already carrying. Petunia led them into the living room, perched on the edge of the sofa, and sat with her hands folded in a way that was trying very hard to look composed. "I don't know what you think you're doing here," Petunia said. "Looking after a child," Molly said. "Which is, I'm afraid, more than I can say for you at present." Petunia's jaw tightened. "Harry is perfectly, Percy," Molly said. Percy took the warrant from his pocket and unfolded it. He'd done something to it, charmed it, she thought, because it unfolded to a size that was considerably larger than its folded form, 3 full pages of dense parchment that snapped slightly in the air with a kind of formal authority. "This is a Wizarding Child Welfare Warrant," Percy said, in the voice he'd been practicing for head boy duties all summer, clear, precise, not unkind but not yielding either. "Issued under Clause 14 of the Magical Family Statutes, countersigned by Professor Albus Dumbledore in his capacity as Designated Officer of Magical Child Welfare under the Educational Amendment of 1935. It has the force of magical law." He paused. "Would you like me to read the relevant clauses?" Petunia stared at the parchment. Her hands, still folded in her lap, had gone white at the knuckles. "Vernon," she said, loudly, towards the stairs. Heavy footsteps. Then Vernon Dursley appeared in the doorway of the living room, and Molly looked at him properly. He was a large man, wide rather than tall, with a thick neck and very little of it, and a mustache that was working very hard to make up for the fact that the rest of his face had very little to offer. He looked at Molly and Percy with the expression of a man who had a great many opinions he was about to express. "What is this?" he said. "Mr. Dursley," Molly said pleasantly. "Do sit down." "I will not sit, Vernon," Petunia said sharply. He sat down. Probably not because of Molly, she thought. Probably because of Petunia. But he sat, which was the important thing. "Right," Molly said. She was still standing. She hadn't been offered a seat and she hadn't asked for one, because she wasn't there to be comfortable and she wasn't there to be a guest. "I'm going to be straightforward with you, because I think you deserve that much and because I don't have a great deal of patience for dancing around things. We are here to take Harry into our care. We have the legal authority to do so. We would like your cooperation, because that will make this easier for Harry, but I want to be clear," and here she looked at Vernon with the full force of something that she was aware had made grown wizards uncomfortable, "that your cooperation is not required." Vernon's face had gone through several colors. It settled on a deep, dangerous red. "You cannot just come into my house and—" "Yes, I can," Molly said. "The warrant Mr. Percy is holding says so. Quite clearly. That's not real law, you people with your—" Vernon stood up, and he was a large man, he was using his size deliberately, leaning forward. "I don't know who you think you are, coming into my house with some piece of parchment, talking about, Mr. Dursley." Her voice hadn't changed. Hadn't risen. Hadn't sharpened into anything theatrical. That was the thing that made it work, the absolute, bedrock certainty of it. Vernon stopped. "There are 6 more of us in the car outside," Molly said. 5 of them are children, and most of them have less patience for this than I do. I would very much like to conclude this civilly, for Harry's sake." She tilted her head slightly. "The warrant requires you to permit access to the child and to assist in the transfer of personal effects. If you obstruct this process, Percy will formally record the obstruction, which will be noted by the Ministry and may result in further legal proceedings." She paused. Or you could just take us to Harry. The silence that followed was so complete she could hear the kitchen clock ticking from the next room. Petunia said, very quietly, he's upstairs. Petunia, Vernon started. Vernon. Something moved across Petunia Dursley's face, not kindness, not guilt exactly, but something in the neighborhood of both, something she'd clearly kept very locked away. Just, let them take him. Vernon looked at his wife. Then he looked at Molly. Then he did what large, opinionated men sometimes did when they met a woman who simply was not afraid of them in any way at all. He deflated, slightly, and sat back down, and said nothing. Upstairs, Molly repeated. Which room? Petunia stood and led them out of the living room, into the hallway, to the foot of the stairs. She pointed up. Second door on the right. She said it without looking at Molly. The locks? Molly said. Petunia said nothing. Molly looked at the door of the understairs cupboard. At the small latch on the outside. At the size of it. She looked back at Petunia Dursley and did not say any of the things she wanted to say, because she was going to maintain her composure, and because this house had a child in it who was possibly listening, and because some things should be said in the right way at the right time. Percy, she said, stay here, please. She turned to the stairs. I'll go up. She knocked on the second door on the right. There was a beat of silence, the kind of silence that had learned to be very, very careful, and then a voice that was trying very hard to sound unbothered. Yeah? She opened the door. The room was small. Clean enough, but sparse in a way that had nothing to do with tidiness and everything to do with absence. A single bed with a blanket that was worn thin at the edges. A desk. On the desk, a small, cracked cage containing an owl who looked at Molly with amber eyes that held what she could only describe as profound relief. A trunk at the foot of the bed. Harry Potter was sitting on the bed when she came in, and when he saw her his face did something complicated, surprise, confusion, a flicker of something that might have been hope that he immediately tried to suppress, because he'd learned, she thought, not to let hope stay visible for too long. He was too thin. She saw it immediately and didn't say anything about it immediately, because he was 12 years old and he didn't need to be looked at like a problem. But she saw it. She filed it. He was wearing clothes that were at least 2 sizes too big, and they weren't old in the comfortable way of well-worn things but in the way of things that had never really been his to begin with. Mrs. Weasley, he said. She went and sat on the desk chair because it felt important not to loom in a doorway, and she looked at him steadily, the way she looked at each of her own children when she needed them to understand she was speaking the truth. Hello, Harry, she said. He was still doing that thing with his face, that careful monitoring of his own expression. She recognized it with a pain so sharp it almost made her catch her breath. She'd seen it in children who'd learned that showing things led to bad outcomes. What are you? He stopped. Started again. Ron texted, he wrote. He said maybe I could come and stay, but I didn't, the Dursleys usually don't. You're coming to stay, she said. With us. He blinked. Did they say yes? I didn't ask, Molly said. He stared at her. There's a legal warrant, Harry, she said gently. It means we have the right to take you into our care. Not for a visit. Properly. For as long as you need. She kept her voice even, matter of fact, because he didn't need drama right now, he needed information. Dumbledore helped make it possible. Percy handled the legal work. She smiled slightly. He was very thorough. Harry was very still. Not the watchful stillness from the hallway, something else. She'd seen this too, in children at the edge of something big. The body going quiet before the heart caught up. You didn't have to, I know I didn't, she said. I wanted to. She stood up. Ron's in the car outside. Fred and George too. And Ginny and Percy. They'll be losing their minds if we're up here much longer. She looked around the room. Is this everything? Your trunk and Hedwig? He nodded, still looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite name. Undone, maybe. Like someone who'd had a very tight thing slowly loosened. That's all I've got, he said. She wanted to say something about that. She didn't. Instead she picked up one side of his trunk, it was heavy, she was glad of it, and looked at him over it. Well then, she said. Help me with this and we'll go. Downstairs, Vernon made one last attempt. He was standing in the hallway when they came down, Harry behind Molly with Hedwig's cage in both arms, and Vernon looked at Harry with something that wasn't quite regret but was in the vicinity of discomfort, the look of a man confronted with evidence that things had gone more wrong than he'd decided to acknowledge. Boy, he said. Harry stopped. Molly watched him. You'll be back, Vernon said, and it wasn't quite a question but it wasn't quite confident. After the school year. You'll, Mr. Dursley, Molly said. Vernon looked at her. He won't be back, she said. Simply. Without cruelty and without softness. Just a fact, clean and complete. And she walked out the front door. Harry followed her, and she heard his footsteps behind her on the garden path, and she heard the door of number 4, Privet Drive close, and then they were in the sunlight on the front path and the Ford Anglia was at the curb and the back doors were opening before they'd even reached the car. Ron was out first, halfway up the path, and he grabbed the other side of the trunk because he'd clearly been sitting in that car waiting to do something for the past 20 minutes and this was what he had available. All right, Harry? Yeah, Harry said, and his voice was a bit unsteady. Yeah, I think, yeah. Then Fred appeared over Ron's shoulder and looked at Harry's face and then at the house and then back at Harry, and Fred Weasley, who had a joke for every occasion and always had and always would, said absolutely nothing. He just put a hand briefly on Harry's shoulder, a single, firm press, and then grabbed the other corner of the trunk and helped haul it to the car. George held the door open. Ginny was visible inside the car, sitting sideways on her seat, watching with that intent focused look that meant she was paying very close attention to things other people weren't. Molly put Harry's trunk in the boot with a charm that settled it neatly, and she took Hedwig's cage from Harry and secured it beside the trunk, and the old owl ruffled her feathers once and settled. Harry got in the car. Molly stood on the pavement for a moment, looking at number 4, Privet Drive. The net curtain in the front window moved slightly. Petunia, she thought. Watching. She thought about what she should feel. She thought about Petunia Dursley, who had known better, who had known exactly what she was doing, who had looked at her sister's boy and chosen, every day for 10 years, to look away. She thought about what kind of grief or bitterness or fear could calcify into that. She thought about whether she could understand it. She could understand it. Understanding it didn't make it all right. Some things could be understood and still not forgiven. She got in the car. Percy was already reviewing his parchment for something. Fred and George were in the back, one on each side of Harry, talking at him in the overlapping way they did that usually meant nobody could panic because there wasn't time. Ron was grinning at something Fred had just said. Ginny was watching Harry with a careful kind of attention that Molly thought Harry probably didn't notice yet. Harry was sitting between Fred and George, holding Hedwig's cage on his lap, and his face was, she watched him in the rearview mirror, his face was the most open she'd ever seen it. He looked stunned. He looked the way people looked in the instant before they realized something was actually real. Right, she said, starting the engine. Everybody in? Yes, Mom. Seat belts. It's a flying car, Fred said. Seat belts seam, seat belts, she said. There was a clicking of seat belts. She pulled away from the curb, signaled as if she were going to take the junction at the end of the road, and then, when they were clear of the street, she touched the stick and the Ford Anglia lifted, smoothly and without fuss, above the rooftops of Little Whinging. In the mirror, she saw Harry look down at the street below, at Privet Drive shrinking to a row of neat identical houses, to a postage stamp, to nothing, and something in his face shift so completely that it was like watching a door open that had been closed for a very long time. "Brilliant," he said quietly. Mostly to himself. Molly smiled, facing forward, both hands on the wheel, and pointed them home. Chapter 2, Number 4. The Ford Anglia had barely cleared the rooftops of Little Whinging before Fred started talking. This was predictable. Fred Weasley processed difficult emotions the way a steam engine processed coal. He fed them straight into the furnace and let them come out as noise and forward momentum. George knew this about his twin and let it happen. Ron knew it and was grateful for it. Harry, who was still sitting between them with Hedwig's cage in his lap and the particular expression of someone who'd been expecting the floor to drop out at any moment and was increasingly confused that it hadn't, seemed to find it grounding in a way he probably couldn't have articulated. "So, Harry," Fred said, leaning back against the car door with one arm along the seat behind Harry's shoulders, "Ron tells us you spent most of last summer indoors." "Yeah," Harry said. "Pretty much." "Define indoors." Harry shifted slightly. "You know. In the house." "Doing what?" "Chores, mostly." "What kind of chores?" "Fred," Ron said, with a warning note. "I'm making conversation," Fred said, perfectly pleasantly. "You're interrogating him. These are completely different things." Fred looked at Harry. "You don't mind, do you?" Harry actually laughed at that, a short, slightly surprised sound, as though his body had done it before his brain could veto it. No, it's fine." He paused. "Cooking, mostly. Cleaning. Garden sometimes." "You cooked for them?" "Yeah." "What did you eat?" There was a beat. Just one beat, but it was a specific kind of pause, the kind that came from someone running a quick internal check on what was safe to say. "Whatever was going," Harry said. George, on Harry's other side, said nothing. He was looking out the window at the motorway below, but Molly could see in the mirror that his jaw was doing the thing again. "Right," Fred said, and his voice had shifted by about 2 degrees, still light, still conversational, but with something careful underneath it, the way you carried a cup that was very full. "Well, Mum's cooking is, I should warn you, it's actually overwhelming at first. You kind of have to pace yourself or you'll just explode." "Fred," Molly said from the front. "Explode pleasantly," Fred amended. "Like a very satisfied firework." Harry laughed again, and this time it stayed on his face for a moment. Small. Tentative. But real. Ginny was watching Harry from across the back seat with the expression she usually reserved for books that had got interesting. She caught Molly's eye in the rearview mirror and gave the smallest nod, the way a field medic might signal, "Stable, for now." Percy, in the front, was reading through his parchment again and making very tiny annotations in the margins. Molly had given up telling him to put things away during car journeys. Some battles weren't worth fighting. "Mrs. Weasley," Harry said, after a minute, and she looked up. "Molly," she said. A small pause. "Mrs. Molly." He said it like he was testing whether it would work. "Did Dumbledore, why now?" He stopped. Started again. I don't mean it like that. I didn't know there was a warrant thing." "Neither did most people," Percy said from the front, without looking up from his parchment. "It's a largely forgotten instrument. Last formally used in 1947. "Percy," Molly said. "He asked," Percy said reasonably. "He asked me," Molly said. "I'll answer." She glanced in the mirror at Harry. "The short version is that the monitoring charms on your magic flagged something that worried Dumbledore. He wrote to me." She kept it simple, because he didn't need every layer of it at once, and because some of what she felt about those monitoring charms and how long Dumbledore had sat on his worry before acting on it was not something she was going to say in a car. I looked into the legal options. Percy made it airtight. I did, Percy agreed, with the quiet pride of a man who had done exactly what he said. Harry looked at the back of Percy's head for a moment. Thanks, Percy. Percy's pen stopped moving for a second. Then he said, without turning around, "You're welcome, Harry," and went back to his annotations, but Molly noticed he didn't write anything else for about 3 minutes. They were 40 minutes out from the Burrow when the conversation from the back seat shifted in a way that made Molly pay closer attention without appearing to. It started with Ron, who had clearly been sitting on something since Privet Drive and could no longer keep it in. He leaned past Fred and said to Harry, in a voice that was trying to be casual and not quite making it, "Hey. The cupboard." Harry went very still. "The one under the stairs," Ron said. "At your house." I think I know. Was that," he stopped. "Was that your room? Before Hogwarts?" The car was quiet. Fred and George had both gone completely still, and that, more than anything, told Molly how serious it was, because Fred and George were never both completely still. Harry looked out the window for a moment. Then he said, "Yeah." Ron said, "Oh. It's fine," Harry said, in the practiced way of someone who had said those 2 words so many times they'd worn a groove. I had it fine. There was space and, Harry," Ginny said. He looked at her. She was looking at him very directly, with those brown eyes that Molly had always thought were more like Arthur's than she let on, warm, but clear-sighted, with a quality of just seeing things that made people feel both understood and slightly exposed. "You don't have to do that," Ginny said. "The thing where you say it's fine." Harry looked at her for a long moment. "What thing?" "You know what thing." He looked away. Out the window again, at the motorway sliding below, at the clouds that were building at the horizon in a white, comfortable stack. He didn't say it's fine again. He didn't say anything, but he didn't have to, because the silence had a different shape to it now. Less sealed. Less defended. George put his arm across the back of the seat behind Harry, mirroring Fred, who still had his arm there on the other side, and said, very quietly, "Right. Just so you know. We're not going to make a big thing of it." Harry frowned slightly. "Of what?" "Any of it," George said. We're going home. And you're coming with us. And that's it." Harry nodded. He was looking at the floor of the car, and Molly could see his throat move. He nodded again, like he was confirming something to himself, some internal decision or permission. "Okay," he said. "Okay," George agreed. Fred, who had been uncharacteristically quiet for about 90 seconds, chose this moment to say, "I should mention, though, and this is important, that George and I have a provisional bet about whether you'll cry at the dinner table on your first night, and if you do, I get 2 galleons, so I'm emotionally invested in your well-being." Harry stared at him. Ron started. "I'm not going to cry at the dinner table," Harry said. "Sure," Fred said, nodding agreeably. "I'm not." "You say that now." "Fred," Molly said. "Mom, I'm being supportive. You're wagering on a child's emotional state. I prefer to think of it as investing in, Frederick." A beat. "Sorry," Fred said, and he meant it, she could hear that he meant it. He looked at Harry. "You probably won't cry. Mum's cooking does make people go a bit watery-eyed, but it's not technically crying." Harry, despite everything, was trying not to smile. She could see it. She faced forward and let herself breathe. Little Whinging was well behind them when the mood in the car shifted again, not because of anything said, but because the landscape changed, the motorways giving way to A roads and the A roads to B roads and the B roads to the kind of winding Devon lanes that hedgerows had been swallowing slowly for centuries. Harry was watching it all with his face turned to the window, and Molly could see the moment the countryside got to him, the moment the tight, suburban, visible from all sides feeling of Privet Drive finally started to loosen its grip, replaced by fields and old trees and sky that went properly wide in the way that Surrey simply didn't permit. He pressed his forehead against the window glass. Just for a second. Then he seemed to remember he was in a car full of people and sat back. Nearly there, Ron said, looking at the passing hedgerows with the recognition of someone who knew every bend of this road. See that farm? The one with the stupid-looking cows? We're about 10 minutes past that. They're not stupid-looking, Ginny said. They have that look, they're cows, Ron. They have a very specific look, you always say that. Because it's always true. Harry looked at the cows as they passed. He didn't say anything about whether they looked stupid. He looked at them the way he looked at a lot of things today, which was like someone cataloging details they intended to keep. Molly watched the last of the beer road slide past and turn down the lane, unpaved, familiar under the wheels in the way of something you'd driven so many times your hands knew the turns before your eyes did. The hedgerows were high on both sides and green and the morning light came through them in broken pieces and then the burrow was there, sitting at the end of the lane the way it always was, improbable and listing slightly to the left and entirely itself. She heard Harry take a breath. That's it, he said. That's it, Ron said, grinning. Harry looked at it, at the house that shouldn't really stand up by any structural principle but did anyway, the garden which was technically a collection of weeds with aspirations, the smoke rising from a chimney even though it wasn't cold, because the kitchen fire liked being lit and nobody had ever had the heart to argue with it. It looks like it's held together by magic, Harry said. It is, Fred said cheerfully. Mostly. The car came to a stop. Doors opened. Harry got out and stood in the lane with Hedwig's cage, looking at the burrow in the morning light, and Molly got out and stood beside him for a moment. Come on, she said. I'll show you your room. But first, because this was the burrow and certain things were inescapable, they had to deal with the garden. 3 gnomes were sitting on the front wall when they came through the gate, which was 3 gnomes too many because Molly had spent an hour on Sunday clearing the front garden and she'd explicitly said, but this was a problem for later, because Harry had stopped in front of the wall and was looking at the gnomes with an expression of complete fascination. One of the gnomes looked back at him. It had a potato-shaped head and small, piggy eyes and it was holding what appeared to be a stolen biscuit. It looked at Harry, decided he was probably not a threat, and went back to the biscuit. They bite, Ron said, from behind Harry. I should mention that. I can see the teeth, Harry said. Yeah, and they're not decorative. George leaned past Harry, grabbed the nearest gnome by one ankle, spun it twice with practiced efficiency, and released. The gnome soared over the hedge and disappeared with a distant sound of impact and gnomish outrage. The other 2 gnomes looked at where their colleague had been, then at George, then departed voluntarily over the wall at speed. There you go, George said. Harry stared at the wall. Then he started laughing, properly this time, not the short surprised sounds from the car but a real laugh, full enough that he had to look away for a second, and Ron grinned at him and Ginny smiled and even Percy looked up from his parchment and permitted himself a small smile before looking back down. Fred said, to no one in particular, I've always said gnomes are actually excellent for morale. You've never said that, George said. I'm saying it now. Inside. The burrow in the morning was a particular kind of alive that Molly had never tried to describe to anyone who hadn't experienced it, because descriptions didn't really cover it. The wireless was going in the sitting room. Something was simmering on the hob, she'd left a pot of soup going on low, set to stir itself, and it had been doing so faithfully since 8 this morning. The clock on the kitchen wall had all its hands in or around home, and the morning light came through the kitchen window and landed across the table in a wide gold stripe. Harry walked in behind Ron and stopped. He stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at everything, at the pot stirring itself, at the clock, at the dishes in the rack, at the cheerful mess of it, the herbs in bunches by the window, the stack of owl order catalogues on the end of the table that nobody ever threw away, the boots by the back door in a collection that had never in living memory contained the right number for the people who lived there. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, quietly, "It's warm." "It's always warm," Ron said. He wasn't talking about the temperature. Molly knew that. She didn't say anything about it, just moved to the hob to check the soup, because sometimes the kindest thing you could do was let a person have their moment without making them perform it for an audience. "Right," she said, with her back turned, giving it a stir. "Harry, I'll take you upstairs." "Ron, you're in with Harry for now, I've put the fold-out in your room." "Fred, George, if the gnomes are back in my front garden by this afternoon, so help me." "Percy, put the warrant documentation in the study, your father will want to see it." She paused. "Ginny, love, can you set the table for lunch? I'll make something proper in an hour." There was a coordinated dispersal, the way there always was after her instructions, not quite military, not quite chaotic, somewhere in the specific middle territory that the Weasley household occupied. Molly heard footsteps on the stairs, the opening and closing of cupboards, Fred and George's voices already fading towards the garden, George apparently still maintaining that the gnomes weren't actually his problem. She heard Harry follow Ron upstairs. She stirred the soup and let herself, just briefly, press one hand against the edge of the counter and take a long breath. She'd done it. The warrant had worked. The Dursleys had conceded, or Petunia had conceded, which was the important concession, and Harry was here, in her kitchen, with the soup and the clock and the boots by the door, and it was a start, it was just a start, but it was a start that mattered. She gave the soup another stir and started thinking about lunch. She was halfway through slicing bread when she heard footsteps on the stairs, not Ron's, which she could identify by their rhythm as easily as she could identify her own children's voices, and Harry appeared in the kitchen doorway looking slightly uncertain about whether he was interrupting. "Come in," she said, without looking up from the bread. "You don't knock in the kitchen." He came in and sat, carefully, at the table, which was an improvement over hovering. He'd changed out of the enormous t-shirt, she noticed, into something that was still too large but less dramatically so, and he'd pushed his glasses up on his nose in the particular way he had that meant he was thinking about something. She kept slicing bread and let the silence sit. "Ron's room is good," Harry said, eventually. "It's chaos," she said. "Yeah." A pause. "I like it." She glanced up. He was looking at a small framed photograph on the dresser, one of the family ones, from 3 summers ago, Bill's graduation week, all of them squashed together in the garden with everyone moving and waving and Fred apparently trying to put a gnome in George's pocket even in the photograph, everyone grinning. "That's Bill," she said. "Our eldest. He's in Egypt at the moment, with Gringotts." Ron mentioned, Harry said. "And Charlie's in Romania?" "Dragons," she said, with a mixture of pride and the specific exhaustion that came from having a son who worked with dragons. "Both of them are completely beyond managing. Have been since they were 5. Harry smiled. "That sounds nice." She put the bread down and looked at him. He was tracing the edge of the table with one finger, not looking at her, in the way of someone who had more to say but wasn't sure if the room was safe for it. "Harry," she said. He looked up. "You're not a guest here," she said. "I want you to understand that. You don't need to ask for things. If you want something to eat, get something to eat. If you can't sleep, come downstairs. The kitchen's always open." He looked at the table. "Okay. I mean it. I know. A beat. I believe you. He stopped. Started again. It's a lot to get used to." "I know that too," she said. "Take all the time you need." She went back to the bread. After a minute, Harry said, "Can I help with anything?" She looked at him. He was sitting up straight, with the attentiveness of someone who'd learned that offering labor was a safe way to exist in a kitchen. She wanted to say, "You don't have to earn your place here. You're here because you belong here, not because you're useful." She said, "Can you get the butter from the cold cupboard? Second shelf." He got up immediately, and she watched him cross to the cold cupboard with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd spent years navigating kitchens on other people's terms, and she thought, "We'll undo all of it, piece by piece, and we'll do it quietly, and it'll take time." He put the butter on the table and sat back down, and she started making sandwiches, and neither of them said anything, and it was the most comfortable silence she'd had all morning. Lunch was loud. It was always loud when all five of them were home, but Harry at the table added a particular quality to it, a kind of brightness, a raised energy that she thought had less to do with Harry himself making noise and more to do with all of them being slightly more themselves because there was someone new to be themselves for. Fred and George were performing at about twice their usual intensity. Ron kept pointing things out to Harry with the enthusiasm of a tour guide who'd been waiting years to give this specific tour. Even Percy had emerged from the study and was sitting at the table with his parchment put away, which was notable. Harry ate 3 sandwiches. He did it with a care that made her throat tight, small bites, methodical, like he was making it last, like somewhere in the back of his mind he was still operating on some economy of food that she intended to dismantle completely. He didn't ask for a third sandwich. Fred pushed the plate towards him and said, "You'll want another one, trust me," in the sort of tone that made it an instruction rather than an offer, and Harry took it, and Molly felt something in her chest ease by about 10 degrees. "So what do you lot do all summer?" Harry asked, somewhere between his second and third sandwich. "Degnome the garden," Ron said. "That's about 40% of it," George agreed. "Exploding snap," Fred said. "A lot of exploding snap." "Dad brings things home," Ginny said. "Muggle things. He brings them home and tries to work out what they do and usually gets it wrong in interesting ways. He had a thing called what was it?" Ron started. "A vacuum cleaner," Percy said. "He tried to use it backwards," Fred said. "The results were," George said. "Extraordinary," Fred finished. "Dad was fine," Percy said quickly. "We never said he wasn't," George said. "Your faces said he wasn't," Percy said. Harry was grinning now. He was sitting at Molly's kitchen table eating a third sandwich and grinning at the story about Arthur Weasley and the reversed vacuum cleaner, and Ginny was watching him with a small smile of her own that she wasn't entirely aware of, and the wireless in the sitting room was going, and the garden outside the window was impossibly green. Molly cut more bread and said nothing and felt a solid, bedrock gratitude that the world was currently exactly this. It was Fred and George who came to find her in the garden at 2 in the afternoon. She was dealing with the gnomes. She'd found 4 more in the vegetable patch, which was unacceptable, and she was degnoming with the focused determination of a woman who needed something physical to do, when she heard them coming through the garden gate together and recognized, from the particular quality of their footsteps, that they wanted to talk to her without anyone else hearing. She launched a gnome into the neighbor's field and turned around. They stood in front of her, and they looked, not like Fred and George, exactly. Not the version of them that performed and deflected. The version that turned up sometimes, usually late at night or in serious moments, that she thought of as the real version, though she'd never say that out loud because they were all real, every version of them. Fred said, "The cupboard." She waited. "We wanted to see," George said. "When you were upstairs getting Harry. We went in the front door and it was unlocked. The latch on the outside was unlocked." She kept her face even. "And?" Fred looked at his hands for a second. "It was tiny, Mum. It had a little cot in it. A proper bed, like a children's cot. And some old drawings on the wall, little kid drawings, and there were scratch marks." He stopped. George picked it up. "On the door frame. From the inside." "Like he'd," "Yes," Molly said. "Quiet." A bee was working its way along the lavender bush by the fence. The afternoon was warm. The scratch marks on the door frame were 40 minutes away, and she was going to stand here in her garden and not cry because crying was not what was needed, and she was not going to do it. How long? Fred said. Percy's estimates suggest at least, until he was 11. Until Hogwarts. She said it steadily. Possibly longer before that. Fred looked at the garden fence. His jaw was set in that way again. George had his arms crossed, and she could see the effort it took him to stay still. He didn't tell us, Fred said. He wouldn't. I know. I know he wouldn't, that's, Fred stopped, blew out a breath. That's the bit, isn't it? He didn't tell us because he doesn't know it's something you can tell people. He doesn't know that's the sort of thing. Yes, Molly said again, softer. So what do we do? George asked. She looked at both of them. Her boys. Who were ridiculous and brilliant and occasionally drove her to the edges of her sanity, and who had, today, been so quietly, steadily good in the car and at lunch that she'd had to remind herself not to say anything about it in front of Harry because he'd have noticed and it would have made him feel like a project. What you've been doing, she said. Exactly what you've been doing. Don't change. Don't handle him. Don't tiptoe. She paused. Just, be yourselves. All the way. Don't dial it back. Fred looked slightly confused. Mom, are you telling us to be more annoying? I'm telling you to be normal, she said. For this house. Loud and warm and daft and, yourselves. That's what he needs. Not sympathy, not careful behavior. Just, normal. She looked at them both. Can you do that? The twins exchanged a glance. The real kind, the private one, the one that happened at a level she'd never quite managed to decode. Obviously, George said. We're already the best at normal, Fred said. Nothing about you is normal, she said. Exactly, Fred said, as if this confirmed his point, and she let out a breath that might have had a laugh in it, and the bee finished with the lavender and moved on. Arthur got home at 6. She heard the pop of apparition outside the kitchen door, and then the door opened, and Arthur Weasley came in still wearing his work robes, a little ink on his left hand as always, with the particular bright-eyed look he got when something interesting had happened at the ministry, but all of that was secondary, because the first thing he did was look at her, and whatever he read in her face made him put his bag down very carefully on the kitchen counter. You got him, he said. He's in the garden with Ron, she said. Fred found a very irresponsible use for an exploding snap deck and they've been out there for an hour. Arthur stood there for a moment, and she watched his face do the thing it did sometimes, the quiet, private shift of a man who felt things very deeply and had learned to feel them quietly. Then he went to the kitchen window and looked out. She went and stood beside him. In the garden, Harry and Ron were in the middle of what appeared to be a vigorous argument about the rules of some game that Fred had clearly invented on the spot and was revising as they went. Harry was standing with his arms out, gesturing, defending some position with the animation of someone who'd temporarily forgotten to be careful about taking up space. Ginny was sitting on the fence watching and interjecting occasionally when she thought one of them was wrong, which was often. Fred and George were on opposite sides, each backing a different interpretation of the rules, each transparently making their arguments up as they went. Harry said something with sufficient force that Ron burst out laughing, and Harry looked at him for a second and then he was laughing too, tipping slightly to the side, one hand coming up to push his glasses back, completely unself-conscious in the way that only happened when you'd forgotten to monitor yourself. Arthur said, quietly, right then. And that was all. But he said it with the particular weight that meant, I see this. I understand what it cost to make it happen. I'm glad. He turned from the window and put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned into him for a moment, just one moment, before she had to go and start dinner. The warrant worked, he asked. Percy was magnificent, she said. Absolutely magnificent. Arthur smiled, warm and wide. Of course he was. I'm going to have to write to Dumbledore, she said. There are things I want to say to him about the timing of his letter that I intend to say very calmly and with very precise language. Of course, Arthur said. I'm not going to shout at him. Absolutely not. I'm going to be very measured and clear about my concerns. Obviously. She looked at him. He looked back at her with a face that was perfectly serious and only very slightly betrayed by the corners of his eyes. Go and say hello to Harry, she said. He's in the garden. Arthur Weasley straightened his robes, ran a hand through his thinning hair, and went out the back door with the expression of a man heading towards something very good, and Molly turned to the stove and started cooking dinner. Outside, she heard the moment Arthur appeared in the garden, a new voice, a burst of Ron saying Dad. And then, clearly, Arthur's voice saying, Harry. Good Lord, you're here. Molly said she was going to sort it. I just didn't expect. How are you? You look. Come here, how on earth was Surrey? And then Harry's voice, surprised and warming, Mr. Weasley, Arthur, Arthur said firmly. It's Arthur. She kept cooking. The kitchen smelled like onions and herbs and the particular good smell of a home that was being used for exactly what it was built for, and outside the window the voices in the garden rose and overlapped with the easy chaotic warmth of a family that had simply added one more, and the clock on the wall ticked steadily. All 7 hands pointed home. Chapter 3, What the House Knows Dinner was shepherd's pie. Molly made it the way she always made it, big enough to feed an army, which was not hyperbole in this household but operational planning, and she brought it to the table in the pot because the pot was too heavy to serve from the counter and also because Arthur had once said that food always tasted better when it came to the table still making noise, and she'd never quite argued with that. It made noise. It bubbled at the edges. It smelled like every good thing about being inside when the evening was coming down outside. Harry sat between Ron and Ginny, which had happened naturally, without arrangement, in the way that the Burrows' dinner table had a way of sorting people. Arthur was at the head with his sleeves rolled up. Percy was across from Harry, still slightly formal in his posture but present, which with Percy counted for a great deal. Fred and George were at the far end, which was tactically important because it meant whatever they were doing was happening as far from the pot as possible. Arthur served. He gave Harry a portion that was, Molly noted with approval, approximately the size you gave a growing 12-year-old boy, not the polite guest portion that would have made Harry feel like he had to perform not being hungry. Harry ate like someone who hadn't been sure there would be enough, and then looked up and found there was plenty, and ate more. She watched it happen from the corner of her eye while she talked to Arthur about his day and didn't make a thing of it. Muggle Artifacts' office had a situation today, Arthur said, with the brightness he always brought to Muggle Artifacts situations. Someone had got hold of a set of traffic cones, you know the orange ones, and enchanted them to actually direct traffic. Into walls, mostly. Very enthusiastic cones. Were people hurt? Percy asked. No. Mostly just confused. One man was directed into a hedge 3 times and kept apologizing to it. Arthur shook his head fondly. The cones had to be recalled, obviously. Shame. They had initiative. Harry looked up at that. He had a fork halfway to his mouth and he was looking at Arthur with the expression of someone checking whether this was a joke. Arthur smiled back at him with complete sincerity, and Harry decided it was both real and funny and went back to his shepherd's pie grinning. Were they actually trying to help? Harry asked. The cones? Arthur considered this seriously. I think so, yes. Misdirected initiative. The enchantment had no concept of where traffic should go, you see, just that traffic should go somewhere with authority. He paused. Rather like Percy in his first year of primary school, actually. Dad, Percy said. You directed the other children to their classrooms on the first day, Arthur said. Several of them weren't in the right school. I was 6. Very authoritative, though, Arthur said, with the gentle satisfaction of a father who had been dining on this story for 11 years. The teachers were quite alarmed. Percy looked at his plate. He was very clearly trying not to smile, and failing in the way that only happened when it was Arthur doing it. Harry was watching this exchange with something open and unguarded in his expression, taking it in the way you took in sunlight when you'd been inside a long time, not blinking, not performing gratitude, just quietly absorbing. After dinner, the table didn't clear itself straight away, which was one of the things Molly liked about dinner. The plates went, yes, and the pot, and the glasses moved themselves to the sink, but the family stayed, sprawled at various angles in the way of people who'd eaten well and had nowhere urgent to be, and the conversation wandered in the undirected way of summer evenings. Fred and George were across from Harry now, engaged in what had begun as a description of their ongoing creative work in what they called, with great dignity, advanced pyrotechnic research, and which Molly called making things explode in ways that hadn't been authorized. The issue, Fred said, is containment. Most of the good effects are contained by the explosion itself. Self-limiting, which is boring. Boring, George confirmed. What we want is an explosion that expands its effects over time. Sustained output. Delayed escalation. Escalating detonation, George said. Right. But the Muggle fireworks, Fred looked at Arthur. Those little cone things with the Roman candles, Arthur said, sitting up. Yes, those. They have a sequence, and Arthur was immediately completely absorbed, leaning forward with his elbows on the table, and the conversation became rapid and technical and enthusiastic in the way that Weasley family conversations about things that could potentially explode always were, which meant most of them. Ron had drifted closer to Harry at some point and they were having a quieter conversation at their end of the table, heads slightly together in the way of people who'd been best friends for a year and had a whole summer's worth of things to catch up on. She caught fragments, Quidditch, Diagon Alley, Seamus tried to, you're joking, I'm not, he actually, normal. Completely normal. Ginny was drawing something in the margin of a notebook she'd produced from somewhere. She'd always been a sketcher, had been since she could hold a pencil, but she was listening to everything, that Molly could tell. Ginny had an attention that covered more ground than most people's, quiet and wide and missing very little. At one point Harry said something about Hedwig, something about her getting restless during the summer, and Ginny said, without looking up from her drawing, she was probably bored. Harry glanced at her. She had the window. Windows aren't enough, Ginny said. If you're smart and you're stuck, windows just show you what you're missing. She said it simply, and kept drawing, and Harry looked at her for a moment with an expression that Molly couldn't read from across the table. Not complicated. Just thoughtful. Yeah, he said. Probably. The clock in the kitchen said 9:30 when Molly finally shooed everyone towards bed with the practiced efficiency of a woman who'd been doing this for 20 years and had learned exactly which resistance was genuine and which was performance. Fred and George claimed they weren't tired, which was true, and she told them she didn't care, which was also true. Percy went without argument, which was both typical and a relief. Ron made it halfway up the stairs before remembering something vitally important he needed to tell Harry, which turned out to be something about their Chudley Cannons posters and where they were positioned, and she let it go because the sound of Ron's enthusiasm was a better sleeping pill than anything she could have provided. Harry was the last one at the table. Not because he was lingering deliberately, she didn't think so, anyway. More that he'd slipped into the particular gear of someone who was very comfortable and had run out of the social energy that came with being new and was now just there, in the most unperformative way. He had one arm on the table and he was reading the back of one of Arthur's Muggle catalogs. Arthur had a stack of them, car catalogs and kitchen appliance catalogs and one baffling one about industrial farming equipment, with the absorbed focus of someone who'd grown up reading whatever was to hand. She was wiping down the counter, half watching him. What is a combine harvester, he said, mostly to himself. Very large, she said. It harvests grain. Arthur has a whole theory about whether they'd be improved with magic. Would they? He says yes. I suspect he just wants one. Harry put the catalogue down and looked around the kitchen in the way he'd been doing all day, these small, systematic takings in, cataloguing details. The clock. The herbs. The boots by the door. The framed piece of needlework above the window that said home is where the heart is, which Fred had amended in pencil at some point to say home is where the gnomes are, and which she'd never quite managed to be cross enough about to redo. You can ask questions, she said. She'd been watching him not quite ask things all evening. He looked at her. What? Whatever you're thinking about. She hung the cloth over the tap. You've been almost asking something for about 3 hours. He was quiet for a beat. Then he said, the warrant. Percy said it was temporary. Emergency temporary custodial responsibility, she said. It gives me the legal authority to act as your guardian until a permanent arrangement is formalized. How long is temporary? That depends, she said, on what we do next. He looked at the table. What are the options? Percy and I will go to the ministry next week with the documentation. We formally register the welfare transfer. After that, we can apply for extended guardianship, which is a longer process but gives you permanent status here. She kept her voice matter-of-fact, because this was information and he deserved it clearly. There may be some challenge to it. The ministry can be bureaucratic about these things. But the grounds are solid. He nodded slowly, the way he nodded when he was filing things away. Okay. Okay, she said. Another pause. You said maybe challenged. Sharp, she thought. He caught that. There's always a possibility with ministry proceedings. But Percy's documentation is thorough. And Dumbledore's letter carries weight. Harry looked at the clock. All 7 hands, she noticed him count them, noticed him do it twice. He didn't say anything about the 7th hand. Not yet. Why are you doing this? He said. The question was direct and quiet, with no art in it, the way a child asked things when they decided to just ask. She stopped wiping the counter and looked at him properly. What do you mean? I mean, he stopped. Tried again. You've got 5 of your own. You've got, he gestured at the house, the generalness of it. You don't have space, or, we have plenty of space, she said. I know, he pushed his glasses up. Why? Specifically. She sat down across from him, which she thought was the right move, because standing and looking down while answering this question was not the right geometry for it. Because Ron wrote me letters about you, she said. All year. He'd never written me letters that long before. And in every single one you were in them, doing something or saying something, and I read those letters and I thought, this boy hasn't got anyone at home who reads his letters about school and thinks he sounds like that. She held his gaze. And then Dumbledore's letter came, and I'd been thinking about it anyway, and so I did something about it. Harry was very still. It's not, you don't need a complicated reason, she said. I saw that a child needed looking after, and I was in a position to look after him, and so I did. He looked down at the table again. His finger was tracing the grain of the wood, the same absent gesture he'd been doing all afternoon. When he looked back up, he said, "Thank you." "Don't thank me," she said, and meant it. "Go to bed." He went, and she listened to his footsteps on the stairs, and she sat for a moment in the warm kitchen with the clock ticking and all 7 hands at home, and then she got up and turned off the kitchen light and went to bed herself. 3 days passed the way good summer days passed at the Burrow, which was to say, loudly, and with frequent minor disasters that turned out fine. Harry settled the way water found its level, gradually, unconsciously, in a series of small adjustments that Molly watched with quiet attention. By the second morning he was awake before Ron and had come downstairs on his own and started the kettle, because he'd noticed she made tea at 7:30, and he'd done it without asking permission or announcing it, just done it, which was a very good sign. By the second afternoon he'd learned which door stuck and kicked it open without breaking stride. By the third morning he was arguing with Fred about whether the Cannons had a genuine shot at the league this year or were, as Fred maintained, definitively doomed, and he was arguing with actual heat, leaning forward, citing statistics, entirely invested. The gnomes came back twice. Harry helped degnome the garden with an enthusiasm that clearly had less to do with the gnomes and more to do with the fact that something in him responded very naturally to physical activity that had clear and satisfying results. He was good at it. He had good instincts and quick hands, and after about 10 minutes Fred had started giving him competitive spin assessments, solid 7. 8 if you get more wrist on the follow-through. And Harry had got more wrist on the follow-through with complete seriousness. He's going to be terrifyingly good at everything, George said to Molly, watching Harry's gnome arc magnificently over the hedge. He already is, she said. He just doesn't know it. But underneath all of it, underneath the good days and the easy laughter and the way he was clearly and genuinely happy in a way he probably couldn't name, there were the other things. The small things that showed up in the gaps. He startled at raised voices, just slightly, just the smallest involuntary tension that she didn't think he knew he had. She tested it by accident the first time. She'd been telling Fred off about something in the kitchen, nothing serious, just the usual calibration, and she'd seen Harry, sitting at the table, go briefly still in a way that had nothing to do with the conversation. She'd wound it back after that. Not gone quiet exactly, but modulated. He ate fast. Not greedy, careful, actually, but with a speed that came from habit, from somewhere that expected the food to stop being available. She put more food on the table than was strictly needed and said nothing about it. He didn't ask for things. He'd get up and refill his own glass of water from the tap rather than ask someone to pass the jug. He'd wait until everyone else had helped themselves before he took seconds. Small, practiced economies of presence, the kind you developed when you'd learned that being noticeable was a liability. She was going to unpick every single one of them. Slowly, without drama, and without ever making him feel like he was a problem being corrected. It was Ginny who found the thing in the garden. For days after they'd arrived home from Surrey, in the late afternoon when the sun was going sideways and gold through the old apple tree in the corner, Ginny came inside and found Molly at the kitchen table going through Percy's ministry correspondence. "Mum," Ginny said. She was holding something. "Where did this come from?" She set it on the table. It was a drawing, done in pencil on a piece of paper that had aged to a soft yellow, small, child-made, careful in the way of a child who was working very hard. It showed a family. 2 adults, a baby, a house. The house had a round door and improbable towers, and the baby had a mark on its forehead. Molly looked at it for a long moment. "The garden," she said. "Under the apple tree." It was folded up small. Ginny sat down. "It came out of Harry's trunk, I think. He was out there for a bit this morning on his own, and then at lunch he seemed fine but quiet." Molly picked up the drawing carefully. The pencil lines were faded. The child who drew this had been very young. 3, 4 maybe. The 2 adults had happy faces, enormous circular smiles, the way children drew happiness when happiness was what they knew. "Lily and James," she said. Ginny was quiet. "He drew this," Molly said. "He must have had it for years. He would have drawn it in the cupboard." She stopped. Started again. "He would have had almost nothing to do in there, and he would have," she put the drawing down. "He would have drawn pictures of a family he barely remembered." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, she could hear Ron and Fred in the garden, the usual sounds of the ongoing argument about Quidditch rules that had been running since Monday. "Is he all right?" Ginny said. "Just, is he? Because he seems all right but I can't always tell with him." "He's better than he was," Molly said carefully. "Better than he's been in a long time, I think." She folded the drawing along its original creases. How did you know where he'd been sitting? Under the apple tree? Ginny shrugged, but it wasn't a careless shrug. He goes there, she said. In the mornings. Before everyone else is up. He just sits under it for a bit. I don't think he knows I've noticed. Molly looked at her daughter, this youngest child of hers, who had her father's warmth and her own particular variety of clear-eyed attention that was all her own. You're very observant. He's easy to observe, Ginny said simply. He's interesting. He is, Molly agreed. And, Ginny stopped. Say it. He's sad, Ginny said. Not devastatingly sad. Not the kind of sad that breaks things. Just. He's got a lot of sad in him from before, and he's not sure what to do with it because he's not used to having enough space to feel it. She looked at the drawing. He's just starting to have space. Molly looked at her 13-year-old daughter and thought that there were things about her that were going to make the world either a considerably better place or a considerably more complicated one, probably both. Don't tell him you saw it, Molly said, sliding the drawing carefully back. Put it back exactly where you found it. Ginny nodded. And if he wants to talk to you, I know, Ginny said. That afternoon, Percy came to find her in the garden. She was harvesting the last of the broad beans. There was something meditative about it, the methodical work of the hands while the mind did what it liked, and Percy appeared at the garden gate with his formal expression on, which meant he had something professional to communicate. I've had correspondence from the ministry, he said. He was holding a letter. Through Dumbledore's office. Acknowledging receipt of the welfare warrant. And? She kept picking beans. The transfer is logged. Formally. Harry is, Percy paused. For the record, officially, he's in our care. The emergency period is confirmed for 90 days pending review. He paused again. I thought you'd want to know immediately. She stopped picking and looked at him. You could have waited until this evening. I didn't want to wait until this evening. She understood that. Percy, who dealt in documents and procedures and the careful architecture of rules, had spent 4 days watching Harry at their table, in their garden, in their kitchen, and the confirmation that it was official, that it was real in the way documents made things real, mattered to him in a specific way. Good, she said. Thank you, Percy. He nodded, not flushing this time, just steady. There's a flag on the file, he said. Nothing serious. Just a notation that the file has been accessed by another party. She straightened. Which party? It doesn't specify. Just a standard ministry notation, file accessed, timestamp. He held the letter out. It might be nothing. Internal review. But I thought, yes, she said. You were right to mention it. She took the letter and read it herself, because Percy was thorough but she liked to be thorough too, and she looked at the timestamp and thought about who might be interested in Harry Potter's welfare file and what they might want from it. Who has access to welfare files, she said. Officially? The welfare officer, the named guardian, the Hogwarts headmaster, and any ministry official above grade 5 with sign-off from their department head. Percy recited this the way he recited everything, from a place of complete confidence. It's a restricted file. The access wouldn't be casual. She folded the letter carefully. All right. I'll write to Dumbledore. Percy looked at her. Do you think I don't know what it is yet, she said. But I'd rather know it's something before it becomes a problem. She looked at him levelly. Don't say anything to Harry about this. Obviously, Percy said, with a dignity that said he'd never even considered it. Good. She handed him the beans. Take these inside, please. She wrote to Dumbledore that evening, after the children were in bed. A careful letter, measured as she'd promised herself, asking 2 direct questions: who had accessed the welfare file, and whether there was any reason to expect opposition to the extended guardianship application. She sent it with their own owl, not Errol, who was currently recovering from the delivery of a particularly heavy package Ron had sent him with last month, but with a neighbor owl she sometimes borrowed, a capable young bird with a good sense of direction. Then she sat for a moment in the kitchen with the lamp on and the house breathing quietly around her. She thought about the scratch marks on the door frame of a cupboard in Surrey. She thought about a small drawing of a family with round happy faces. She thought about a boy who startled at raised voices and ate fast and filled his own glass of water rather than ask. She thought, whoever accessed that file, whatever they want, whoever is about to make this complicated. It doesn't matter. He's here. He's officially here. And I am considerably more persistent than anyone who might want to challenge that. The kitchen clock ticked. All 7 hands at home. She went to bed. The thing about the Burrow was that it had its own kind of intelligence. Not the showy kind, not the responsive enchantments you got in places like Hogwarts, stone that listened, staircases with opinions, but something quieter and more accumulated. 40-odd years of Molly's magic lived in the walls. Small charms she'd cast once and left running, maintenance spells that had deepened over time, the particular imprint of a house that had been genuinely loved. The heating knew when people were cold before they said so. The doors knew who needed a quiet room. The kitchen knew, without being told, what time of day it was and what that usually meant. She'd never explained this to anyone because it had always just been the Burrow, the way the Burrow was. But on the 5th morning, she was at the hob when Harry came downstairs early, earlier than usual, maybe 6, the sun just starting to get serious about the day, and he stopped in the kitchen doorway and she heard him make a small sound she hadn't heard from him before. Not distress. Not even surprise, exactly. More like recognition. The way you made a sound when something you'd been hoping for turned out to be true. She turned around. He was standing in the doorway looking at the corner of the kitchen where the small armchair lived, the battered one that had been there since before Bill was born, reupholstered twice, one arm held on with a charm that she kept meaning to do properly and kept not getting to. It had been in the corner. It was now, she noticed, positioned slightly differently, turned by some inches towards the window, towards the morning light that came in from the east at this hour in a way it didn't in the afternoon. The Burrow had moved a chair. The Burrow had moved a chair for a boy who liked to sit in the morning light. Harry looked at the chair and then at her, and she could see him trying to work out whether he was imagining things. "Sit down," she said, turning back to the hob. "I'll do eggs." He sat in the armchair. She heard the small creak of it taking his weight, the familiar sound she knew the way she knew all the sounds of this house. There was a moment of quiet. "Did the chair," he started. "The house does things sometimes," she said. "Old house. It has its ways." He was quiet for a moment. Then, very quietly, "It moved it for me?" She turned around and looked at him, sitting in the armchair in the morning light, looking young and confused and moved in the way of someone encountering something completely outside his map of how the world worked. "Apparently," she said. Harry looked at the chair. He put his hand on the armrest. Something crossed his face that she was going to call, privately, dawning, because it was the closest word she had. "Okay," he said, to himself or to the house or to nobody. She did eggs. Harry sat in the morning light. Outside the kitchen window, the garden was doing what it always did, going about its own business, slightly wild, determinately itself, and the house settled around them with the particular quiet satisfaction of something that knew exactly what it was doing. Ron appeared at 7, hair doing its finest impression of a troll's, and stopped at the foot of the stairs. "Are you in Mum's chair?" he said to Harry. "Apparently," Harry said, mildly. Ron considered this. "Is she?" He looked at Molly. "Eggs?" she said. "Yeah," Ron said, and came in and sat at the table, and that was that. On the 6th day, Molly went into the garden at dusk to bring in the washing, one of the few household tasks she didn't charm entirely, because she liked the physical part of it, the folding, the warm weight of clean fabric, and found Harry under the apple tree. He was sitting with his back against the trunk, knees up, reading one of Ron's old Quidditch books with the concentrated absorption he brought to things he was genuinely interested in. Hedwig was on a low branch above him, apparently asleep, one foot tucked up. The evening was soft and warm and golden in the way of late July, the kind of light that made everything look painted. He heard her come through the gate and looked up, and there was no startling, no quick self-monitoring, no checking whether he'd done something wrong. He just looked up and said, "Ron says you don't watch Quidditch." "Ron is technically correct," she said, unpinning a shirt. "I watch them watch Quidditch. That's more interesting." Harry thought about this. That's fair, actually. She worked along the line. Harry went back to his book. The owl dozed. The evening made its careful way towards purple. "Mrs. Weasley," Harry said, after a while. "Molly. Molly." He said it more easily now, she noticed. Almost natural. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." He was quiet for a moment, gathering it. "What happens, if the Ministry challenges the warrant? Or the guardianship application? What are the chances?" She kept her hands moving, folding. "That's what Percy and I are going to the Ministry about next week." "But what are the chances?" he said, and there was something in it, not panic, because Harry Potter was not someone who panicked openly, but a careful steadiness that was doing a lot of work. She stopped folding and looked at him directly. "The grounds for your removal from the Dursleys are documented and solid," she said. "Percy's warrant was legally correct. Dumbledore's endorsement is in writing. The monitoring record of magical suppression is Ministry's own data." She held his gaze. "The chances of a successful challenge are low." "Low isn't zero," he said. "No," she said. "It isn't." "But Harry," she kept her voice level, kept the anger out of it, because the anger was there, it was just pointed elsewhere. "I want you to hear me when I tell you this. I am not walking away from this. No one is going to walk in and take you back to that house. I will not permit it." He looked at her for a long moment. Checking for the gaps, she thought, the places where promises usually had their trapdoors. She let him look. She had nothing to hide in it. "Okay," he said. First time he'd said it without the slight upward inflection that made it a question. She went back to folding. Harry went back to his book, and Hedwig drowsed on her branch, and the apple tree was very still in the evening air, and somewhere in the house behind her the Burrow went on being exactly what it was, warm, and loud, and fractionally magical in all the right ways, with 7 people inside it where there had been 6, and not a single corner of it that seemed to think this was anything but exactly as it should be. Chapter 4, The Drive Home. It started with rain. Not the dramatic kind, not the thunderous summer storm that announced itself with full theatrical intent, just the quiet, insistent Devon rain that arrived in the night and was still there in the morning, soft and grey and completely committed to itself. It made the Burrow feel sealed in a good way, the way a ship felt sealed, the world outside made muffled and the world inside made brighter by contrast. Harry had been at the Burrow for 6 days now. Molly noticed things. She'd been noticing things for 6 days with the attentiveness of someone conducting a very quiet, very careful survey. And what she noticed on the morning of the 7th day, rain against the windows, everyone inside by necessity, the house in a particular mood of domestic closeness, was that something had shifted overnight. It was small. It was the kind of thing that only registered because she'd been watching. Harry came downstairs and went directly to the cold cupboard and got himself a glass of milk without hesitation, without looking to see if anyone was watching, without the half-second pause he'd been doing, the checking pause, she'd come to think of it, the is this allowed pause, every time he'd taken something for himself since he arrived. He just got the milk. Closed the cupboard. Sat at the table. She was at the hob with her back turned and she smiled at the hob and didn't say a word. Fred appeared 12 minutes later, poured himself tea, and said to Harry, "Chess or exploding snap, with the tone of a man settling the most important question of the morning. "What time is it?" Harry said. 8:15. "Chess," Harry said. "Bold choice for someone who loses badly. I beat you twice on Thursday." "I was distracted on Thursday." "You said that on Friday too." George appeared in the doorway behind Fred, pointing at Harry with a look of exaggerated approval. "He's learning," he said, "to no one in particular." Fred looked at his twin with a wounded expression. "Whose side are you on?" "Entertainment side," George said, and sat down, and the morning began. By 11, the whole family was in the sitting room in the particular configuration that only happened on rainy days, scattered across every available surface, Ron and Harry on the floor by the coffee table with a chessboard between them, Fred on the sofa reading something that was probably not improving, George on the rug doing something with a small packet of what Molly had identified as filibuster fireworks and decided to investigate later, Ginny in the armchair with a book, Percy at the small writing desk in the corner with the door open so he could hear everything while maintaining the fiction that he was working. Arthur was at the table in the kitchen with 3 Muggle catalogues and a cup of tea, transcribing things into a notebook with the energy of a man pursuing scholarship. Molly was doing the mending with her wand, which was meditative in the way the mending always was, and listening to the room. Ron's chess pieces were, as always, exceptionally opinionated. Harry had apparently learned since first year not to take their instructions personally, but he still winced slightly when his own bishop told him he was playing like a distracted flobberworm. "Your bishop is rude," Harry said. "They're all rude," Ron said. "You get used to it." "How?" You accept that they're right and you move on." Harry looked at the bishop. The bishop looked back at him with the flat contempt of a piece who had seen a great many bad moves and expected this one to be no different. "Knight to f4, Harry said. The bishop made a sound of profound suffering but moved. "Huh," Ron said. "Good," Harry said. "Don't get smug," Ron said, and was quiet for a moment with his chin on his fist, studying the board in the manner of someone taking the situation considerably more seriously now. Fred looked up from his book. "Ron's worried," he said to no one in particular. "I'm not worried," Ron said. "You've got the face." "I don't have a face." "You absolutely have a face," George said, not looking up from the fireworks. Ginny turned a page. "He does have a face." "You didn't even look up," Ron said. "I don't need to," Ginny said. Harry was trying not to grin and failing comprehensively, and Ron pointed at him and said, "Don't," and Harry put his neutral face on with visible effort, and the chessboard's bishop said something deeply cutting that nobody fully caught but that made Percy, in the corner, let out one brief sharp sound of suppressed laughter before going back to his parchment. The rain intensified around noon, which was when Arthur appeared in the sitting room doorway with the expression of someone who'd had an idea. Everyone in the room went slightly alert. Arthur's ideas had a range. "I was thinking," Arthur said, "that since we can't go outside, and since Harry hasn't had the full tour," "Of what?" Harry said. "The car," Arthur said. "I know you've been in it. But have you actually seen it? Properly?" Harry looked at Ron. "He means from underneath," Ron said. "And the engine. And the charm matrices." "I did the expansion charms myself," Arthur said, with the particular pride of an enthusiast. 6 layers. The interior volume is technically, well, I'm not sure, technically possible, is entirely accurate, but it works, which is the important, Arthur, Molly said from the mending pile. "Don't take the car apart in the sitting room." "The garage," Arthur said. "Obviously." Harry was already standing up. The garage was a low stone building at the side of the property that was theoretically for the car but was actually more of an annex to Arthur's study, a place where things that weren't strictly related to the car accumulated in layers of enthusiastic disorder. Muggle objects in various states of investigation covered the workbench along one wall, a toaster that had been carefully disassembled and not yet reassembled, 2 alarm clocks, a thing with dials that Harry identified as a voltmeter, and several objects that nobody had yet worked out. The Ford Anglia sat in the middle of it all with the patient dignity of a car that had been through quite a lot and expected more. Ron and George and Harry followed Arthur in, and then Fred followed because he'd decided the fireworks could wait, and Ginny came and leaned against the door frame because she had a general policy of being wherever interesting things were happening. Arthur began to explain the charm matrices with the focused joy of a man who very rarely got to talk about this in depth to someone who was genuinely listening. Harry was genuinely listening. He had that quality, she'd watched it over the week, of real engagement when something interested him, the kind that was physically visible, his whole attention pointing at the thing like a compass needle. This section here, Arthur said, running a hand along the driver's side door, is the primary invisibility charm. It was already there when I got the car, its factory, essentially, from whoever I bought it off. But I've modified it. The original was on-off, very binary, very limited. Mine is, well, Percy would say graduated. Graduated, Percy said from the doorway, where he'd materialized without anyone noticing. Spectrum-based visibility. Fully invisible, partially visible, the shimmer you get when it's half on, and fully visible. Plus the Muggle-specific variant where it's visible to magical eyes only. How did you do the Muggle-specific one? Harry asked. Arthur beamed. Literally beamed, in the way he did when someone asked exactly the right question. Muggle repelling charm, modified. Instead of repelling them, it just bends their attention slightly. They see the car but immediately find something else more interesting to look at. It's essentially the same principle as the Fidelius but much, much simpler and completely non-exclusive. So it's not invisible, Harry said. It's just boring. Arthur stared at him for a second and then let out a bark of delighted laughter. Yes. Exactly. It's just boring. I have never put it that way but that is precisely, it's just boring. Molly. He raised his voice. Harry says, I heard, Molly called from the house. Harry grinned, and Arthur looked at him with the expression of a man who had found an ally, and Fred said to George, he's in Dad's inner circle now. It's official. Deeply unfair, George agreed. I've been here 17 years. I said the car had initiative once, Fred said. He didn't beam at me like that. You said it had too much initiative, George said. Well, it had flown into a tree. It was avoiding a lorry. It did not avoid the tree, Harry was laughing again. The garage, which was cold and slightly damp from the rain, had the warmth of people in a space together, the particular warmth of something being shared, and Molly, listening from the kitchen with the door between them open, let herself hear it. Lunch happened, and the afternoon happened, and the rain showed no inclination to stop. It was at 3:30 that Molly, coming in from the small stone porch where she'd been watching the garden drown in a perfectly pleasant and non-worrying way, found Harry alone in the kitchen. Not unusual, not alarming. But he had a piece of parchment in front of him and a quill and he was staring at it with the expression of someone who had been trying to write something for a while and hadn't managed to start. She didn't comment. She went to the kettle. Tea, she said. Yeah, he said. Then, please. She made tea for both of them and put his in front of him without asking how he had it, because she'd been watching for 4 days and she knew exactly how he had it. He looked at the mug and then at her, clocking that she'd got it right without asking, and she saw him file that away. Letter, she said, nodding at the parchment. He looked at it. Trying to be. To who? A pause. The Dursleys. She sat down across from him. I don't know what to say, he said. He wasn't asking for help, exactly, more thinking out loud to someone he'd decided he trusted to hear it. I keep starting and it comes out wrong. Either it sounds like I'm apologizing for leaving, which I'm not, or it sounds, I don't know. Angry. Are you angry? She said. He considered this with the seriousness he brought to things when he wasn't reflexively saying I'm fine. A bit, he said. Not the kind of angry where I want to shout at anyone. Just the quiet kind. The kind that's just there. She wrapped both hands around her mug. You don't have to write to them. I know. But you want to. He was quiet for a moment. Dudley's my cousin, he said. He's not great. But he's 12. And I've lived in that house my whole life, and just leaving without, he stopped. It feels wrong to just disappear. She looked at him. 12 years old, sitting at her kitchen table in the rain, trying to figure out the ethics of a situation that most adults would have handled with considerably less consideration. Say exactly what you just said to me, she said. That you know it was the right thing but you wanted to say goodbye. Keep it short. You don't owe them a long letter. He looked at the parchment. Then he picked up the quill and started writing, and she drank her tea and didn't read over his shoulder, and the rain came down. He was done in 5 minutes. He read it back. He folded it. He looked at it for a moment and then looked up. Thanks, he said. Anytime, she said. Hedwig can take it if you want. Yeah. He stood. Then he said, almost as an afterthought, I don't think they'll write back. Maybe not, she said. That's okay, he said. And this time she thought he meant it. He went upstairs with the letter. She sat with her tea and the sound of the rain and thought about a 12-year-old who wrote letters with more grace than most adults. It was the evening that cracked things open. She hadn't planned it. She didn't think Harry had planned it. These things didn't tend to get planned. After dinner, beef stew, the long slow kind, the kind that had been going since morning and rewarded patience. Arthur had the wireless going, and Percy had retreated to his room, and Fred and George had disappeared upstairs to do something that would almost certainly require explaining in the morning, and Ginny had gone to write in her diary, and it was just Ron and Harry at the table. And then Ron announced he needed the bathroom and simply didn't come back, because Ron had the bladder of someone who had grown up sharing a bathroom with 4 brothers and had developed the survival skill of always finding something else to do when a bathroom was occupied. So it was just Harry at the table, and Molly doing the washing up, and Arthur at the end of the table rereading something from the Prophet with his reading glasses on. Harry said, "Can I ask you something, Mr. Weasley?" Arthur looked up over his glasses. "Arthur," he said, for the 4th time that week. "Arthur," Harry said. "Sorry." He was quiet for a second. "Did you know my dad?" The washing up continued. Molly kept her hands in the water and her attention on the plates. Arthur set the Prophet down. He took off his reading glasses and folded them carefully. "A little," he said. "He was a few years ahead of me at school. Gryffindor, like you." He paused. "He was the sort of person you knew about rather than the sort you knew personally. Very present. Everyone knew when James Potter was in a room." "In a good way or a bad way?" Harry said. "Mostly good," Arthur said. "He had a lot of confidence. The kind that other people found funny rather than irritating, mostly. Though I imagine some found it irritating." He smiled. "He was excellent at Quidditch. Which you know because everyone knows. But he was also very loyal. The kind of loyal that made him run at things that were dangerous when the people he cared about were in them." Harry was very still and very attentive, the way he got when someone was giving him something he'd been looking for. "Your mother I knew better," Arthur said. "She was in my year. Exceptionally clever. The kind of clever that was generous about it, she didn't use it to make other people feel dim." He paused. "She was good at defense against the dark arts in the way that some people are just naturally good at it, where the spells come from the right place inside them. You know what I mean?" "I think so," Harry said. "She was kind," Arthur said, and said it simply, without decoration, the way you said things that didn't need decoration. "That's what I remember most about her. She was genuinely practically kind. Not the polite kind. The kind that actually did things. Harry looked down at the table. He put his hand flat on the wood, that gesture, the one she'd seen over and over, the grounding one. Were they happy, he said. Before. I mean, when they were young. Just. Were they? Arthur looked at him for a long moment. Yes, he said. I think they were very happy. Harry nodded. Very slightly. He was looking at the table and she could see his throat move. She kept her hands in the washing up and didn't turn around, because he didn't need to be witnessed right now. He needed to be allowed to have it. Arthur picked up his reading glasses again and put them back on and said, casually, lightly, without making it a transition, the car's been asking about you, by the way. Harry made a sound that was half laugh, half something that wasn't a laugh. The car asks about people? Not in so many words. But it started this morning and drove 3 feet forward and stopped, which in car terms I've come to think of as attention-seeking, Harry said. Exactly, Arthur said. I'm glad someone else gets it. And the moment had been and gone and become the next thing seamlessly, and Harry's breathing had evened out, and Molly took the last plate out of the water and dried her hands on the tea towel and turned around to find the kitchen looking exactly as it always did. Normal. Completely, extraordinarily normal. At 9 o'clock, Ron reappeared. He had, it turned out, got into a book, which he reported with the slightly stunned air of someone who had not expected this to happen to them, and he and Harry went upstairs, and Arthur folded his profit, and the house settled. Molly was banking the kitchen fire when she heard footsteps on the stairs. Not coming down, not going up, stopping. She turned around. Harry was halfway down the stairs, sitting on the 4th step, which was the widest one, the one that you could sit on without being on the stairs or in the kitchen, the one that the children had used her entire adult life as a thinking place and an eavesdropping place and a place you went when you weren't ready to be in a room but weren't ready to be alone either. He didn't say anything. She didn't say anything. She sat down at the kitchen table, not facing him, not making it a confrontation, just present. The way you were present when something needed you nearby without making demands of you. I keep thinking, Harry said, to the stairs or the air or nobody, about what would have happened if you hadn't come. She didn't answer immediately. What would have happened? I don't know, he said. Same as every summer, I suppose. I'd have gone back to Hogwarts in September and it would have been fine. He paused. It was always fine. She turned and looked at him on the stair. He was hugging his knees, looking at nothing specific. It wasn't fine, Harry, she said. Gently, but plainly. You know that now. He was quiet for a long time. Yeah, he said, eventually. I'm starting to. She let that sit. I used to think, at Hogwarts, the first year, when I found out what I was, he stopped. Restarted. When I found out I was famous and people knew my name and all of that. I kept thinking it must have been wrong. Because famous people don't live in cupboards. They don't wear other people's clothes and get told not to eat the leftovers. He looked at his hands. I thought maybe there'd been some mistake. That someone would realize and send me back. Back to the cupboard? Back to being nothing, he said. Not self-pity, just factual, in the flat way of someone stating a thing they've accepted. Back to being the kind of person things happen to. Not the kind things happened for. The fire was low. The kitchen was warm. She didn't speak immediately because what he'd just said needed room. You know what I think, she said. He looked at her. I think things happen with you, she said. Not to you or for you. With you. And I think the difference matters. He frowned slightly, working it out. How? Something happening to you, that's passive. You're the object of it, which is exhausting and which tells a very limited story about who you are. She rested her forearms on the table. Something happening for you suggests you're owed things, which is its own trap. But with you, that means you're in it. You're a participant. Things happen in your presence because of what you bring to them. She paused. Which is considerably more interesting. Harry was looking at her with the full weight of his attention, the way he looked at things he intended to remember. That's a very Gryffindor answer, he said. She raised her eyebrows. I was head girl, she said. It would be a very poor show if I couldn't muster a Gryffindor answer. He laughed, short and genuine. I didn't know that. Ron never mentions it, she said. He finds it embarrassing, I suspect. He should be proud, Harry said, and he said it easily, naturally, the way you said things about families that were yours to say things about. She noticed. She didn't remark on it. Right, she said, getting up and banking the fire properly. Bed. He uncurled from the step. Mrs. Molly. Yes? He was standing on the step with one hand on the banister, and he looked at her with the expression she'd been seeing more of over the past week, open, slightly undone, but not in a way that asked for rescue. More like a window that had been opened. Thank you, he said. For, tonight. And the whole, he waved a hand at the kitchen, the house, the general everything of it. You're welcome, she said. Good night, Harry. Good night, he said, and went upstairs. She stood in the kitchen for a minute after he'd gone, listening to the rain, which had softened from its afternoon insistence to something quieter and more considered. Then she heard, from Ron's room, the low murmur of two boys talking, the particular, quiet, content sound of a long conversation that wasn't going anywhere, that didn't need to go anywhere. She heard Harry's voice and Ron's voice, back and forth, and a laugh at something, muffled by the ceiling and the late hour. She turned off the kitchen light. The rain was done by morning. She was in the garden at 6:30, early, checking the broad beans that had been getting rather a lot of water and needed seeing to, when she heard the back door open. She expected Ron, or possibly Fred with a scheme. But it was Ginny, in her dressing gown with her hair loose and a mug of tea in each hand, who crossed the wet grass in bare feet with the complete commitment to her task and handed one mug to Molly and then stood beside her looking at the garden. It's a nice morning, Ginny said. It is, Molly agreed. They stood together in the early sun. The wet garden was catching light in the specific way it only did after rain, each leaf and blade doing something briefly spectacular. He's going to be all right, isn't he? Ginny said. Not quite a question. Yes, Molly said. He is. Ginny drank her tea. She was looking at the apple tree, which was dripping quietly in the early light. I know you said not to make a big thing of it, Ginny said. And I haven't. But I wanted to, I wanted you to know that I'm glad you went to get him. I know it was the warrant and Percy did the legal work and all of that. But you went. You just went. She paused. Not everyone would have done that. Molly looked at her daughter. 13 years old in a dressing gown with wet grass on her feet, saying things with the precision of someone older. Someone had to, Molly said. I know, Ginny said. I just wanted to say I'm glad it was you. They stood in the garden and drank their tea, and the house behind them began to stir, footsteps, a door, the low morning sound of people waking, and the day came on like all the best days did, without drama, from the east, steady and unhurried. Inside, the clock on the kitchen wall ticked. 7 hands. All of them home. Chapter 5, the Burrow. The 7th hand had appeared on the clock on the 4th night. Molly knew this because she was the one who'd come downstairs at 2 in the morning for a glass of water and found the clock doing something she'd never seen it do in 37 years of living with it. The hands usually stayed fixed, moved only when someone arrived or left or the situation genuinely changed. She'd watched Bill's hand swing to traveling when he left for Egypt and felt the particular maternal lurch of it, the physical reality of her child being far away. But the 7th hand had grown. That was the only way she could describe it. The clock face had accommodated. It hadn't broken or cracked or stretched obviously. It had simply made room, the way living things made room, and the new hand was a little shorter than the others, slightly rougher in its make, as though the clock had produced it from its own materials without a template. It pointed at home with a steadiness that seemed almost emphatic. It didn't have a name on it yet. The other hands had names: Bill, Charlie, Percy, Fred, George, Ron, Ginny, painted in the small neat lettering she'd done herself years ago with a fine brush. This one was blank. She stood in the dark kitchen and looked at it for a long time. Then she went back to bed. She told Arthur the next morning before anyone else was up, speaking quietly over the early tea, and Arthur had set his mug down very carefully and gone to look at the clock, and stood in front of it with his reading glasses on, and said nothing for almost a full minute. The clock claimed him, Arthur said. Yes. The clock. Our kitchen clock. Decided on its own. Clocks don't decide things, she said, coming to stand beside him. This one does, Arthur said, with the complete confidence of a man who had lived with this clock for 37 years and had long since made his peace with what it was. I need to paint his name on it, she said. Yes, Arthur said. You do. She'd gone upstairs and got her finest brush and the small pot of gold paint she used for special occasions. The letters on the hands had always been gold, her own decision made in the first year of their marriage, and she'd come back and stood on a chair and painted, in the smallest and most careful letters she was capable of, 1 hand and 7 letters. H. Potter. She did it with no ceremony, and then she got down from the chair and put the paint away and started breakfast, because that was how these things were done. Quietly, and then you made breakfast. Harry had noticed it at lunch. She'd been watching for it with the same focused attention she'd watched for everything this week, and it happened at about 5 minutes into the meal, when the conversation had moved from something Fred had done to something George had done in response to something Fred had done, and Harry reached for the water jug and looked up at the clock to check the time and then looked back at the jug and then stopped. He looked at the clock again. Slowly. His eyes went along the hands the way you read something you wanted to make sure you'd read correctly. He found the 7th hand. He read what was on it. His face did something she was going to spend the rest of her life trying to describe and never quite getting right. Not surprised, exactly, or not only surprised. It was the look of someone who had been walking a very long road and had just seen, at the end of it, a light. Mom, Ron said, and she could tell he'd seen it too. He'd been waiting for Harry to notice, probably all morning, and his voice had that particular suppressed excitement. When did? Yesterday, she said, without looking up from her plate. Pass the potatoes, Fred. Fred passed the potatoes. The conversation moved back to whatever he'd done. Harry looked at the clock once more, quietly, and then he looked at his plate, and she could see him swallowing something that wasn't food. He didn't say anything about it. He didn't have to. A week became 10 days became 2 weeks, and the Burrow shifted and settled around this new configuration the way it shifted and settled around everything, noisily, generously, without making any particular fuss about it. Harry's things spread. Not dramatically, not the messy colonization of space that Ron was capable of. His trainers acquired a spot by the back door. His owl had taken over the highest shelf in the utility room as a perch because the window there caught the afternoon sun. His Quidditch book lived on the kitchen table by the armchair that the house had moved for him, because he read it in the mornings and it was easier to leave it there. Small things. But things that stayed. Fred and George had escalated their pyrotechnic research to a level that required Molly's direct intervention twice and her indirect intervention approximately constantly, but Harry had become their enthusiastic audience and occasional experimental assistant, which meant they were at least performing their disasters in the garden where she could see them. She'd heard Harry say, after a particularly vigorous explosion that had relocated a garden gnome about 4 gardens over, that was actually brilliant, and Fred had looked at him with the expression of a man who had found his ideal critic. Percy had taken to leaving his parchment and books on the kitchen table sometimes, working alongside whoever happened to be there, and she noticed that Harry asked him questions occasionally, careful, specific questions about magical law, about how ministry systems worked, and Percy answered them with genuine thoroughness, treating Harry's interest with the respect he gave anyone who was actually interested. It wasn't dramatic. It was just two people in a kitchen occasionally having useful conversations. Ron was simply Ron, which was to say, the best possible version of exactly himself, noisy and loyal and incapable of pretense in any direction. He and Harry moved through the Burrows days like they'd been doing it for years, falling into the easy rhythms of a friendship that had been forged fast and had turned out to be the durable kind. Ginny. Molly watched Ginny and Harry with the particular attention she gave things she wanted to understand, and what she saw was not the terrible crush she'd braced herself for, that was still there, probably, she wasn't blind, but underneath it something more interesting and more durable, a genuine recognition. They understood each other in some specific way. When Harry was quiet, Ginny left him to it without performing the leaving. When Ginny said something sharp and observant, Harry reacted like a person receiving useful information, not like someone managing a girl. They were going to be important to each other. She thought that. She didn't say it, because saying it would make it a thing to be embarrassed about when it wasn't, it was just true. Arthur, of course, had simply added Harry to his mental category of people who understand why things are interesting, which was Arthur's highest category, and talked to him about Muggle engineering and magical theory with the unself-conscious delight of someone who had finally found a new member of an extremely specialized book club. The Burrow held all of it. That was the thing about the Burrow, it had never struggled with more. More children had always produced more warmth rather than less of it. She thought sometimes that the house genuinely ran better when it was full. She was writing her letter to Dumbledore, the calm, measured, carefully worded letter she'd been composing in her head for 2 weeks, on a Friday morning when Errol came in through the kitchen window. Errol arrived the way he always arrived, which was to say, dramatically, and then recovering with dignity. He hit the window frame, banked left, righted himself, and deposited a letter on the table with the authority of an owl who had absolutely meant to do it that way and would hear nothing suggesting otherwise. She picked up the letter. Official Ministry Stationery. That particular shade of parchment they used, heavier than the normal kind, with the seal impressed rather than stuck. She recognized the seal of the Department for Magical Law and Community Affairs. She broke it open. She read it twice, quickly. Then she put it flat on the table and went to the foot of the stairs. "Percy," she said. Percy read it with his head bent and his face completely controlled, which was how she knew he was doing the internal equivalent of what she was doing, which was managing her response very carefully so she could act on it rather than at it. "It's a standard challenge notification," he said, when he'd finished. "Formally, it's a request for a hearing before the Welfare Board to review the original warrant grounds and the interim custody arrangement." He put the letter down. "They've set a date. 3 weeks. Who filed the challenge?" Percy looked at the letter. "The notification doesn't name a challenger directly. It says, a party with standing has raised concerns." He paused. "Which is technically legal. You can file anonymously at first submission, the challenger's identity is disclosed at the hearing itself." She looked at him steadily. "What's our position?" "Strong," he said. "The warrant was correctly issued. The grounds, the monitoring data, the physical evidence, the conditions at Privet Drive, are documented. Dumbledore's endorsement is in writing." He paused again, in that way that meant there was something else. But, she said. "The challenge will be heard by the Welfare Board, which is a ministry body. And the ministry," he chose his next words carefully. "There are people within the ministry who might prefer Harry Potter's living arrangements to remain as they were." She looked at him. "Because?" Percy's jaw was set. "Because Harry Potter under a Muggle roof, unreachable and largely forgotten, is considerably more manageable than Harry Potter in a magical family's care." She let that sit. "Right," she said. "I don't want to be alarmist," Percy said, and the fact that he said it told her he was, precisely, being a little alarmist and knew it and was doing it anyway because the situation warranted it. But whoever filed this challenge has standing, which means it's someone with a connection to Harry's welfare record. That's not a long list. No, she said. It's not. She looked at the letter on the table. 3 weeks. A hearing. Someone with standing who didn't want Harry here. Well. She folded the letter and put it in her pocket. Get out the warrant documents, she said. All of them. Let's go through everything. She didn't tell Harry that day. Or the next. She told herself it was because she needed to know more before she had something concrete to tell him, and that was true. She told herself she wanted Percy's full analysis before raising it, and that was also true. She told herself there was no point worrying him before there was something specific to worry about. The honest reason was that she watched him in the garden on Saturday afternoon. The afternoon sun was back, and he was on his broom about 20 feet up, practicing rolls with a focus that was almost meditative, with Fred calling out suggestions from the ground that Harry was sometimes taking and sometimes professionally ignoring, and he looked, for the first time since she'd watched him through a kitchen window at Privet Drive, like a boy who was entirely in his own body. Present. Not monitoring himself. Not editing. She couldn't make herself interrupt that. Sunday was easier to justify. Sunday was Arthur's project day, and he'd got the car out of the garage and had Harry and Ron and George helping him with something involving the Muggle-specific invisibility charm that Molly had no strong opinions about as long as no one was underneath the car when anything activated. Percy worked at the kitchen table. Ginny helped Molly in the garden. Fred read. The wireless played. It was a very good Sunday. She told Harry Monday morning. She'd made the decision Sunday night while Arthur was asleep, lying in the dark doing the mental accounting of it, and she'd arrived at, he deserves to know. He's the one the challenge concerns. He's not a child to be managed around the edges of his own life. He's 12, not 2. She waited until the house was quiet, mid-morning, Ron upstairs, twins in the garden, Percy already across the warrant documents in the kitchen with his second cup of tea and a very focused expression. She sat at the table and said, Harry. Come and sit down. He came and sat. He looked at her face, and then at Percy, and then back at her, with the instinct for threat that came from years of learning to read a room quickly. Something's happened, he said. There's been a challenge to the welfare arrangement, she said. Someone has filed with the ministry. There will be a hearing in 3 weeks. Harry was very still. Who filed it? We don't know yet. It'll be disclosed at the hearing. He was quiet for a moment. She could see him processing it, going through it, the way he did, the methodical way. What does that mean for, he stopped. Am I going to have to go back? No, she said. But, Harry. She looked at him squarely. I want to be very direct with you. Someone has filed a challenge and we don't know who yet. That's the sum total of what we know right now. Percy has been through the documentation and our legal position is strong. The warrant was correctly issued. The grounds are solid. She let that land. I'm not going to tell you not to worry about it, because that would be condescending. But I am going to tell you that I'm handling it, Percy is handling it, and Dumbledore is being written to today. She paused. Okay? He looked at her. That checking for trapdoors look, the one that appeared less and less now but was here today because the stakes were higher than they'd been. He found nothing to doubt. She watched him find nothing to doubt. Okay, he said. And then, with a directness that she thought he'd learned partly from her, over the past 2 weeks, I want to come to the hearing. Percy looked up from his parchment. That's not standard procedure, Percy said. The named individual in welfare hearings isn't typically present, it's considered, I want to come, Harry said again. Not a demand. Not a whine. A clear, quiet statement of preference from someone who had spent too much of his life having decisions made about him without his presence. She and Percy looked at each other. "Let me see if it can be arranged," she said. Harry nodded. He looked at the table for a moment. Then he looked at the clock. 7th hand, pointing home, steadfast. He looked back at her. "Thank you," he said. "For telling me." "You had a right to know," she said simply. He went back upstairs, and she heard his footsteps even and steady, not running, not the particular quick retreat that meant he was hiding, just walking. She turned to Percy. "I want him there," she said. Percy considered this for exactly 2 seconds. "It's unorthodox," he said. "But there's nothing in the statutes that explicitly bars the named individual's presence. Especially at 12, the age threshold for welfare hearings is, look it up," she said. He was already looking it up. Dumbledore's reply arrived on Tuesday, carried by the large, self-important school owl that she'd never quite liked, and she read it in the garden while the household went about its morning. It was a long letter. Dumbledore wrote long letters when he was being careful, and she read it twice to get past the careful parts to the actual information. What he told her was this: the challenge had been filed through the office of Cornelius Fudge. Not by Fudge directly, it was more complex and more political than that, which was its own problem, but through his office, at the instigation of someone whose name Dumbledore either did not know or had chosen not to write in a letter, both of which possibilities she disliked equally. The stated grounds of the challenge were that the emergency warrant had been issued without proper ministry oversight and that the Welfare Board review was a standard procedural step, which was technically true and technically not the point at all. Dumbledore would be at the hearing. That, at least, was clear. And his letter had a section, near the end, that she read 3 times and thought about carefully. "I underestimated the urgency of Harry's situation and the speed with which you would act on it. I did not expect you to move so quickly, or so effectively, and I will admit that my initial relief was followed closely by a concern I did not properly account for. Harry Potter's custody is of significant strategic interest to several parties, some of whom mean him well and some of whom do not. You have claimed him, Molly, in the most legally robust and publicly visible way possible. That is good for Harry. It may make certain things more complicated for you. I intend to ensure that those complications resolve in your favor." She folded the letter. Certain things more complicated. She thought about that on the way back inside. She thought about it while she made lunch, and thought about it while she listened to Fred explain to a skeptical Ron why exploding Snap could theoretically be played competitively as a professional sport, and while she watched Harry correct Fred's arithmetic with an ease that surprised Fred visibly, and while she watched her family be exactly what it was, loud and layered and completely without apology. She thought, let it be complicated. Come and make it complicated. Bring your ministry procedure and your anonymous challenges and your strategic interests, and I'll be here at my kitchen table with Percy's parchment and Arthur's charms and 6 children who have decided on a 7th. I have made my position very clear. She came downstairs at midnight on Tuesday and sat at the kitchen table in the dark. She didn't turn the lamp on straight away. She just sat, in the warm dark of the kitchen, with the clock ticking and all 7 hands at home, and let herself have 5 minutes of feeling all the things she'd been being sensible about all week. She was frightened. She was allowed to say that, in the dark, to no one. She was frightened that the hearing would go badly, that someone with more ministry power and more political leverage than a Weasley family with good legal work could overwhelm what she'd built in 2 weeks. She was frightened that Harry would have to sit in a ministry room and watch a bureaucrat explain why he should go back to a place that had done him harm, and that there would be nothing she could do to stop it. She was frightened that she had got him here, that she'd watched him start to unfold, that she'd put his name on the clock, and that it might be taken back. She sat with all of that for exactly 5 minutes. Then she turned on the lamp, got out her best parchment and her good quill, and started writing the outline of her hearing strategy with the same focused energy she'd applied to every hard thing she'd ever done, completely, without holding anything back, and with the deep practical certainty that there was no problem that couldn't be approached from a better angle if you were willing to do the work. She'd been writing for about half an hour when she heard the third step from the bottom creak, the one that everyone in this house knew about and therefore stepped over, except Harry, who hadn't learned it yet. She looked up. He was at the bottom of the stairs in his pajamas, hair going in every direction, glasses not on yet, blinking in the lamplight with the expression of someone who had been awake for a while and had eventually given in and come downstairs. "Can't sleep," she said. It wasn't a question. "No," he said. "Sit down," she said. "I'll put the kettle on." He sat at the table, across from her, where he'd been sitting for 2 weeks now, where she thought of as his spot in the way that certain spots just became people's spots when they were in a house long enough. He looked at her parchment without reading it, in the considerate way of someone who knew it was hers. She put the kettle on and got 2 mugs. "I've been thinking about the hearing," he said. "So have I," she said. "I've been thinking about what happens if, Harry," she said, from the counter. "I've been doing this family for 20 years. He waited. 20 years of Weasleys. Do you have any idea what that involves?" She came back to the table with both mugs, sat down, slid his across. "Bill had a phase of trying to communicate exclusively in ancient runes at age 9. Charlie kept a dragon egg in his room for 3 weeks and I found it accidentally by sitting on it. Fred and George," she paused. "Fred and George are an ongoing situation that I have been managing since 1978 and continue to manage, and I want you to understand that if I can handle that, I can handle a ministry hearing." Harry was looking at her with a different expression now. The frightened part of it had unwound a little, replaced by the beginnings of something more solid. "The difference," he said, "is that Fred and George aren't." He stopped. "I mean, I'm not. I don't have the name that they have, and people don't. You think the name makes it harder," she said. "Doesn't it?" She considered being measured about this. She decided against it. "Yes," she said, honestly. "The name makes it more complicated. There are people who think Harry Potter's living arrangements are their business. They're wrong, but that doesn't stop them thinking it." She looked at him. "But here's the thing, Harry. The name that makes it complicated is the same name that's on our warrant, and on Dumbledore's endorsement, and on the monitoring record, and on the ministry's own file. Your name, your particular name, carries weight everywhere it goes. That cuts both ways." He thought about that. She could see him turning it over. "I never thought of it cutting my way," he said. "I know," she said. "That's something we're going to have to work on." He drank his tea. She went back to her parchment and wrote another section. The kitchen was warm. The clock ticked. Outside, the Devon night was very quiet, the kind of quiet that had birds in it somewhere, distant, thinking about morning. "What are you writing?" Harry said, after a while. "Arguments," she said. "For the hearing. Every angle I can think of, every legal precedent Percy has found, every piece of evidence we have." She paused. "I'm making it comprehensive." Harry was quiet for a moment. "Can I help?" She looked up. He was sitting straight, with the same expression he'd had in the car with Arthur talking about the charm matrices, engaged, real, pointed. "I mean, I know things about Privet Drive that aren't in the warrant. Things that would be, I don't know if they're relevant." She held his gaze. "Everything's relevant until I've heard it." He thought about it. Then he said, carefully, "The summer before first year. I didn't know I was going to Hogwarts yet, and my cousin Dudley's birthday was coming, so there was a lot of planning for that. Food and presents and a trip to the zoo." He paused. "I didn't go to the zoo." She waited. "I mean, I went," he said. "But I wasn't part of the birthday. I was there because there was no one to leave me with. I was there because not taking me would have been more trouble than taking me and ignoring me." He said it without particular emotion, in the flat tone of someone reporting an established fact. And at the zoo there was an incident with a snake, which was me, sort of accidentally, but before that, he stopped. Before that, we went to a restaurant. And they didn't order for me. She didn't move. Like, there was an oversight, he said. Or not an oversight. I think it was deliberate, actually. And I didn't say anything because saying something would have been worse. So I just didn't eat. For the whole trip. From breakfast. He paused. I was 11. She picked up her quill. Tell me everything you remember, she said. Take your time. Don't edit anything out. He looked at her, at the quill, at the parchment, at her face. Everything, he said. Everything, she said. And Harry Potter, at midnight at the kitchen table of the Burrow, with a mug of tea gone slightly cold in front of him and 7 hands on the clock all pointing home, started to talk. She wrote it down. All of it. Every careful, measured, flat-toned recollection, every small incident that he'd filed away in the category of just how things were, every moment that had taught him to minimize and manage and make himself easy to overlook. She wrote it down without interrupting, without visibly reacting, with the focused professionalism of someone doing a very important job. Inside, she was doing other things. But she kept that separate, because he needed a recorder right now, not a mother's reaction. He talked for 2 hours. At 2:30 he ran out of things that seemed relevant and sat back, looking slightly undone, the way people looked after they'd said something they'd been carrying for a long time. Like putting a heavy thing down and not quite knowing what to do with your hands. Thank you, she said. She put the quill down. The parchment was full on both sides. He looked at it. Was that useful? Extremely, she said. He looked at the table. I've never actually said all of that. Out loud. To someone. He paused. It was a lot. Yes, she said. But it's okay, he said, and this time she heard something different in it, not the practiced, reflexive it's fine, but something that was working its way towards actually being true. Like something said aloud stops having the same weight as something only thought. She stood up and collected the parchment and put the kettle on again. I'll make more tea, she said. And then we'll both go to bed, and in the morning this goes to Percy and he adds it to the documentation and we have an even stronger case. Harry nodded. He looked, she thought, a stone lighter. Maybe 2 stones. Molly, he said. Yes? He looked at the clock. 7th hand, his name on it, steady as any of the others. He looked back at her. He opened his mouth. Closed it. Opened it again. She could see him trying to find words for something that was larger than the available words. You put my name on it, he said. The clock. Yes, she said. Before the hearing. Before you knew it would, before you knew for certain. Yes, she said again. He was quiet. The kettle was beginning to hiss. The kitchen was warm. Why? He said. Barely above a whisper. Not suspicious, not disbelieving, just genuinely, deeply asking, the way people asked when they were asking about something that mattered so much they could only manage it quietly. She stood at the counter and looked at him steadily. Because it was true, she said. The clock doesn't need permission. It just needed someone to pick up a brush. He looked at the clock again, and she turned to the kettle, and neither of them said anything else for a while, and the house held them both in the specific, undemonstrative warmth of a place that knew exactly what it was and exactly who was in it, and considered the number 7 not an addition but a correction, the world finally become accurate. Chapter 6 claimed the Ministry of Magic smelled like parchment and ambition and the particular kind of anxiety that came from people who were very important telling themselves they were very important. Molly had always found it slightly airless, even in the atrium with its high golden ceilings and the fountain that everyone admired and nobody sat near. She walked through it on a Thursday morning with her family around her and her parchment in her bag and felt none of the airlessness at all. Percy was on her left, carrying the documentation in a leather folder that he'd bought specifically for this occasion and which he held with both hands with the focused reverence of a man transporting something that mattered. Arthur was on her right, in his best robes, which she'd pressed last night while he slept because she needed something to do with her hands. Fred and George were behind her, quiet in a way that had its own particular weight, the twins in formal dress robes, hair combed, the performance of themselves dialed back to something that was still entirely themselves but pointed inward, concentrated. Ron was beside Harry. Harry was in the middle of all of them. She'd told him what to wear, his Hogwarts robes, because they were the cleanest smart thing he had and because they declared something without saying it out loud, and he'd come downstairs this morning with them on and his hair making its usual undefeated argument against order, and she'd looked at him and said, "Good. Let's go," and meant it. He'd been quiet in the car and quiet on the walk from the Flowpoint to the atrium. Not frightened quiet. She'd been watching for frightened quiet and this wasn't it. It was the concentrated quiet of someone who had decided to be here, fully, and was making good on that decision. Ginny was with them too. She hadn't been in the original plan had been a small, efficient group, but Ginny had appeared at breakfast in her good robes and said simply, "I'm coming," and Molly had looked at her face and made an executive decision that the plan was flexible. They crossed the atrium together and went to the lifts. The Wizarding Child Welfare Board occupied a suite of rooms on the 4th floor that had clearly been designed to look reassuring and had not quite succeeded. There were comfortable chairs in the waiting area, and a painting of a meadow on the wall, and a small table with a conjured vase of flowers, and all of it had the quality of comfort that had been installed rather than grown. It made you feel, subtly, that you were expected to be grateful to be here. Molly was not grateful to be here. A clerk at the desk gave her parchment forms to fill in, which Percy took from her and completed in about 4 minutes with an efficiency that made the clerk blink. While Percy wrote, Molly looked around the waiting area. There was someone already there. A man in ministry robes, mid-50s, with a sharp face and the particular posture of someone who'd spent their career making themselves useful to powerful people. He was sitting with his legs crossed and a thin folder on his knee, and he was looking at them with the controlled expression of someone who'd been expecting them and had prepared an expression for the occasion. Molly looked back at him. She didn't look away. He looked away first. "Who is that?" Harry said quietly, on her left. "I don't know yet," she said. "But we'll know shortly." A door opened and a small, brisk woman in green robes came out and looked at the room. "Weasley party and opposing counsel, please come through." The hearing room was small and round, with a circular table at the center and 7 chairs around it. Not a court, the board wasn't a court, Percy had explained, it was a review panel, which meant procedure was more flexible and evidence was weighed differently. No Wisengamot. No gallery. Just the table and the chairs and the 3 board members already seated, a witch with silver-streaked hair, an older wizard with a beard and a slightly distracted expression, and a younger woman who was writing something and didn't look up when they came in. Dumbledore was already in the room. He was standing by the window with his hands folded behind his back, looking at the street below as though it were more interesting than it probably was, and when the door opened he turned around and looked at Molly with an expression that she thought was the closest he came to apologetic. She gave him a nod that conveyed, "I have things to say to you and this is not the time for them." He received it perfectly. "Professor," Harry said. Dumbledore looked at Harry with those pale blue eyes and said, quietly and with a completeness of attention that she'd always found both impressive and slightly irritating, "Harry. You look well." "I am," Harry said. And the way he said it, direct, even, without the reflexive apology that had been in his voice 2 weeks ago when he'd said anything positive about himself, made Dumbledore's expression shift into something warmer and more real than his usual careful manner. "Good," Dumbledore said. "That is the point of all of this, after all." They sat. Molly, Arthur, Percy, Harry. The man from the waiting area sat across from them with his thin folder, and she got his name from the clerk's introduction, Bartholomew Rowe. Senior advisor to the office of the Minister for Magic. Not Fudge himself. The man Fudge sent when he wanted something done without being seen to want it done. She looked at Rowe across the table and thought, I know exactly what you are. The silver-haired witch at the head, the board's chair, a woman named Heliodora Osei, introduced herself and her colleagues and said the standard opening language about the hearing's purpose and procedure. Molly listened with one layer of her attention and used the rest to watch Harry, who was sitting beside her with his hands flat on the table, looking at the board, steady. He caught her looking and she gave him the smallest nod. He nodded back. The matter before us, Heliodora Osei said, is the emergency welfare warrant issued in favor of Molly Weasley on the 14th of July, providing temporary custodial responsibility for the minor Harry James Potter. A formal challenge has been submitted by the Office of the Minister, representing a concern regarding procedural compliance and the suitability of the arrangement. She looked at Rowe. Mr. Rowe. Your opening. Rowe was smooth. She'd expected that. He had the particular smoothness of someone who'd worked in political offices for a long time, who knew how to sound reasonable while saying things that weren't, how to use technical language to make simple things seem complicated and complicated things seem settled. He didn't challenge the warrant's legality directly. She'd expected that too. Percy's work was too tight to challenge directly. Instead, he challenged the circumstances. The board will appreciate, Rowe said, in the voice of someone addressing reasonable people who would naturally appreciate things, that the welfare warrant, while a valid instrument, was issued with unusual speed and without the standard ministry oversight review. The Office of the Minister has no objection to ensuring Harry Potter's well-being, that is, naturally, a priority shared by all parties. He paused, in the way of someone who wanted you to notice the pause. However, the question of where that well-being is best served requires careful consideration. The Weasley household, while generous in its intentions, is not a formally approved welfare placement. There are questions of stability, resources, suitability, Molly said. Rowe looked at her. The board chair glanced at her with mild surprise, because she hadn't been invited to speak yet. Suitability on what grounds, she said, keeping her voice pleasant in the way that required effort and she was willing to expend it. Mrs. Weasley, Heliodora Osei said, we'll come to your response in a moment. I don't mind, Rowe said, smoothly. It's a fair question. He looked at Molly with the expression of someone who'd been hoping for an interruption because it made the other party look emotional. The Weasley household is, we mean no disrespect, a large family in modest financial circumstances, without formal welfare training or ministry certification. The warrant doesn't require ministry certification, Percy said. Flat. Clean. Not interrupting so much as correcting. Rowe looked at Percy with the expression of someone who had not expected the 17-year-old to speak. It requires the counter-signature of a designated officer of magical child welfare, Percy continued, which was provided by the headmaster of Hogwarts under the Educational Amendment of 1935. I have the statute here if the board would like to see the relevant text. He opened his folder and extracted the parchment without particular urgency, the way you extracted evidence you'd been expecting to use. I also have the warrant itself, the welfare monitoring record from the ministry's own trace department, and 47 pages of documented evidence regarding conditions at the minor's previous residence. Silence. Fred, who was sitting one chair down and had not spoken and would not speak, was looking at Percy with an expression she'd only seen once or twice on him, pure, unambiguous pride. George was doing the same. Rowe recovered quickly. The board appreciates the documentation, he said. However, the question of, can I say something? Everyone in the room looked at Harry. He was still sitting with his hands flat on the table, and he was looking at the board chair, not at Rowe, with the expression of someone who had decided to do something and was doing it. Heliodora Osei looked at him. Then at Molly. Then back at Harry. You're Harry Potter? The named individual? Yes, he said. You're entitled to speak, she said, after a moment. You're old enough, and the warrant specifically. She looked at the younger board member, who found the relevant clause and nodded. Yes. Please. Harry took a breath. He looked at the table for 1 second, gathering, not losing nerve, and then he looked at the board. I lived at Privet Drive my whole life, he said. I know what my aunt and uncle are like. I know what the warrant says and what's in Percy's 47 pages, and most of it is true. He paused. Most of it is actually less bad than the truth because I didn't say the worst parts when I was filling in forms. I said the parts that sounded believable. The younger board member had stopped writing. I'm not here to make anyone feel sorry for me, Harry said. I just want to say, I've been at the Burrow for 2 weeks. 2 weeks. And I know what a real house feels like now. I know what it feels like when someone feeds you because they want to feed you, not because they have to. I know what it feels like when someone puts your name on a clock because, he stopped. Started again. Because it's true. Because that's what you are to them. He looked at the board steadily. I want to stay. That's what I'm saying. I'm 12. I know that doesn't decide anything, but I want it on record that I'm not here under protest, and I'm not confused about what I want, and I'd like it if the board actually waited that. He stopped. His hands were flat on the table. Heliodora Osei was looking at him with an expression that had moved some distance from procedural neutrality. Molly did not look at Harry because if she looked at him she was going to do something that wouldn't help the hearing. Rowe cleared his throat. The office of the minister doesn't dispute the young man's expressed preference. Then what, Arthur said, in the quiet, even voice that Arthur used when he was genuinely angry, is this hearing actually about? Everyone looked at Arthur, because Arthur Weasley rarely deployed that voice and its appearance was notable. Because I've been listening, Arthur said, to quite a lot of language about procedure and suitability and stability. And I'd like someone to tell me directly, not in ministry language, directly, what outcome the minister's office is actually seeking here. Rowe looked at him. Something shifted very slightly in Rowe's expression, the controlled smoothness developing a small crack where the actual person inside was either uncomfortable or recalibrating. The minister's office, Rowe said carefully, has a responsibility to ensure that the welfare of a public figure, a significant figure, is managed with appropriate oversight, Arthur said. Yes. You want oversight, Arthur said. Of our family. Of the arrangement, Mr. Rowe. Arthur's voice was still even. Still quiet. It was one of the more frightening things she'd ever heard from him, and she'd been married to him for 20 years. Harry is a 12-year-old boy who was living in a cupboard. That is not a political arrangement. That is a child. Our family has taken that child in legally and with his own full willingness, and we have done it because it was the right thing to do. If the ministry's interest is genuinely in his welfare, then the hearing is concluded, because his welfare is being served. If the ministry's interest is something else, he looked at Rowe across the table, and she thought, there is Arthur Weasley, who has never sought power or importance or position, and who is currently being more formidable than half the ministry put together, then I would appreciate some honesty about what that something else is. Rowe was silent. The board chair looked at Rowe for a long moment. Then she looked at the 2 members beside her. Something passed between the 3 of them that was too subtle for conversation but too deliberate for coincidence. Dumbledore had not spoken yet. He'd been sitting at his end of the table with his hands folded, and he had the quality of someone who was waiting for the right moment with great patience and complete confidence. Molly had been aware of him the whole time the way you were aware of a large and complicated piece of furniture, peripheral, significant, present. He chose now. If I may, he said, and it wasn't a question, it was a courtesy announcement, and everyone in the room adjusted their attention accordingly because Dumbledore's voice in a room did that. I would like to speak to the question of oversight, he said, since it appears to be the heart of the matter. The ministry's desire to maintain visibility over Harry Potter's life is not new and is not entirely unreasonable given the circumstances of the past decade. I understand it. He paused. What I do not accept, and what I believe the board would be ill-advised to accept, is the use of a welfare instrument as a mechanism for political access. The welfare board exists to protect children, not to provide administrative leverage over them. Rowe said, with respect, Professor, the warrant was correctly issued, Dumbledore continued, in the pleasant, implacable way he had of continuing through interruption. The grounds were sufficient. The documentation is thorough, I have reviewed it myself and I was, frankly, impressed by the rigor. He looked briefly at Percy, who sat fractionally straighter. The placement is stable, willing, and demonstrably beneficial to the child's welfare. I have seen Harry Potter in one context for the past year and I have been watching him today, and I can tell you with complete professional confidence that the 2 weeks he has spent with the Weasley family have done more for his well-being than the 10 years preceding them. He looked at the board. I am not in the habit of appearing at ministry hearings, he said. I have better uses for a Thursday morning. I am here because this case warrants it, because this child warrants it, and because I owe him my presence at least, having failed to provide it somewhat sooner than I should have. He said the last part simply, without deflection, the admission sitting cleanly in the air. I support the permanent extension of the welfare arrangement and the formal guardianship application. I recommend the board approve it without delay. He folded his hands and said nothing else. The room was quiet in the specific way of rooms where something conclusive had just been said. Rowe looked at his folder. He opened it, closed it. He looked at the board chair. He seemed to be doing a rapid private calculation, the kind that happened when a strategy had run into a wall and you were working out whether to push harder or retreat professionally. He retreated professionally. The minister's office, Rowe said, with the careful diction of someone composing on the fly, has no objection to the board's review proceeding on its own merits. Our concern was procedural, and the documentation provided has adequately addressed the procedural questions. He paused. We would note, for the record, that the minister wishes Harry Potter well. Noted, Heliodora Osei said dryly. The board took 12 minutes to deliberate. They went into the small side room and the door closed and the hearing room was quiet except for the very faint sound of the atrium below. Fred leaned across George and said to Harry, very quietly, Percy said 47 pages. I heard, Harry said. He was up until 2 in the morning 3 nights in a row. Harry looked at Percy, who was reviewing his parchment with the expression of someone who considered the review necessary and was not particularly interested in being thanked. Percy, Harry said. Percy said, not looking up. Thank you. Percy stopped reviewing his parchment. He was quiet for a moment, in the particular Percy way that meant something was happening internally that he was deciding whether to express. He looked up. You're worth the work, Percy said, and went back to his parchment, and Fred looked at George with an expression of genuine surprise, and George looked back at Fred with an expression that said, I know. Write it down. Dumbledore had moved to the window again. Molly got up and went to stand beside him, because this was the conversation she'd been waiting for and the 12 minutes were available. Your letter, she said quietly. Yes, he said. You said you should have written sooner. I should have, he said. By approximately 9 years. She looked at him sidelong. I'm not going to shout at you. I know, he said. That is, in some ways, more effective. She looked out the window. The street below was ordinary and busy in the way London streets were ordinary and busy. When I got your letter, she said, I was angry. I want you to know that. I expected nothing less. And I understand why it took the time it took. I understand that you had reasons, and that some of them were good reasons, and that the rest were the kinds of reasons that are very hard to argue with in the moment. She paused. But I want you to understand that a reason that makes sense strategically is not always enough. Sometimes a child needs someone to decide the strategy is wrong. Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. Yes, he said. I understand that better now than I did. Good, she said. Molly, he said, and his voice had a quality she didn't usually hear in it, simpler, stripped of the usual layered weight. I am glad you went. She looked at him. So am I. They stood at the window until the side room door opened and the board came back. Heliodora Osei sat back at the head of the table and looked at the documents in front of her and then at the people in front of her and said, "The board has reviewed the emergency warrant, the supporting documentation, and the testimony heard today. We find the original warrant to have been correctly issued, legally sound, and appropriately grounded in evidenced welfare concerns." She looked at Roe, briefly, in the way you looked at a thing that was technically present but no longer particularly relevant. The procedural challenge is dismissed. She looked at Molly. The board approves the extension of temporary custodial responsibility for the period pending formal guardianship application. We also note, given the minor's expressed preference and the quality of documentation provided, that we are prepared to expedite the guardianship application review. She glanced at Percy. If the application is filed within 2 weeks and the documentation is of comparable quality, the board can convene a fast-track review rather than the standard 90-day period. Percy already had a quill out. Understood, he said. It will be filed within a week. Heliodora Osei looked at Harry. Mr. Potter, she said. Your presence here today was noted and appreciated. For the record. Harry nodded. Thank you, he said. Clean and direct. We're adjourned, she said. They spilled out into the corridor outside the hearing room, and for a moment everybody just stood there, and it was the specific standstill of people who had been braced for a fight that had been won. Then Fred said, "Right," and grabbed Harry in a headlock from behind with both arms, which George immediately joined from the front, and this became a general melee that involved Ron enthusiastically and Ginny with precision and which ended with Harry red-faced and laughing, genuinely laughing, glasses askew, both arms up in the useless defensive posture of someone who had given up on defending himself and was fine with it. Arthur watched this from a few feet back with his hands in his pockets and the expression he got sometimes when he was trying to contain himself and wasn't quite managing. Roe passed them in the corridor going the other way and did not look at any of them and moved quite quickly. Dumbledore shook hands with Arthur, exchanged a word with Percy, and paused in front of Harry as the melee settled. Well done, he said. Harry looked at him. I just said true things. Yes, Dumbledore said. That is often the most difficult thing to do. He looked at Harry for a moment with that particular quality of attention that always felt like he was accounting for something, adding it up, making note. You have grown up considerably in 2 weeks, Harry. I don't think it was 2 weeks, Harry said. He glanced sideways at Molly. I think it was one conversation at midnight. Dumbledore smiled, not the public smile, the real one, which she'd only seen a handful of times. Perhaps, he said. He looked at Molly. I'll see you at the start of term. You will, she said. He walked away down the ministry corridor in his robes that were somehow always slightly more impressive than they had any right to be, and the family stood together in the corridor, and the Ministry of Magic went about its important business around them entirely oblivious to the fact that something had been settled here that mattered considerably more than most of what it usually got up to. They had lunch on the way home. Not planned, Fred spotted a Muggle fish and chip shop from the car window when they were coming through a town and said the word chips with the reverence of someone naming a deity, and Arthur had the car parked before the sentence was finished, because Arthur on any day was enthusiastic about Muggle food and on a day like today was invincible. They sat in a row on a long bench at the front of the shop, squashed together, 7 plus Arthur, eating chips out of paper with the indiscriminate satisfaction of people who had done something hard and deserved something simple. Harry ate his chips without monitoring himself. She noticed that first. Then she noticed he'd taken the paper bag Fred offered him without the checking pause. These are incredible, he said to Arthur. Why are they incredible? Salt and vinegar, Arthur said confidently. And the muggle fat they cook in. I have a theory that there's something in the particular temperature they use. There's not a magical explanation, Percy said. There might be. There isn't, Dad. How do you know? Because I've read extensively. You haven't read extensively about chip fat, George said. I've read, Percy stopped. I haven't specifically read about chip fat. Then the theory stands, Arthur said, with tremendous satisfaction. Harry was grinning again, and it struck her, sitting on that bench with her family and him, outside a chip shop in a Devon town, the legal victory warm and real, and concluded, that over the past 2 weeks, she'd watched his face change. Not dramatically. Not all at once. But the monitoring quality had left it, the constant low-level audit of the environment, whether it was safe to take up space. It came back sometimes, she expected it always would to some degree. Old habits made in survival conditions didn't leave fast. But it wasn't his resting state anymore. His resting state was this. Eating chips. Arguing with Percy about cooking temperatures. Leaning against Ron with the unconscious ease of someone who'd forgotten to be careful about contact. She ate her chips and said nothing and was deeply, quietly glad. They got home in the late afternoon, the Burrow appearing at the end of the lane in the gold light of a July evening, sitting exactly as it always did, improbable, listing, entirely itself. Harry got out of the car and stood looking at it for a moment, the way he'd stood looking at it the first time they'd come home, except that the expression was different. The first time it had been wonder, tinged with the slight incredulity of someone who expected things to be taken back. Now it was something else. Recognition, she thought. The feeling you had looking at something that was yours. He'd picked up his trunk before anyone else had moved, because he knew where it went, and he went through the garden gate ahead of Ron without looking back for guidance or permission, and the gnomes on the front wall saw him coming and departed voluntarily, which they only did with family members and which she chose to find amusing rather than significant. Inside, the house did its usual thing. The wireless kicked on. The kitchen fire, which had been banked low, brightened. The armchair turned itself another 2 degrees towards the window, settling in for the evening. Harry stood in the kitchen doorway, trunk at his feet, and breathed in the smell of it, stone and wood and whatever was still in the crockpot from this morning, and the general warm accumulated smell of a house that had been loved for decades, and she watched him do it and felt that thing again, the thing she'd felt the first day he ate 3 sandwiches, the tight thing in her chest loosening by degrees. Right, Fred said, appearing behind Harry and depositing his own things in a heap just inside the door. Exploding snap. Tonight. Harry, you're on my team. Why am I always on your team when you've decided it's competitive? Harry said. Because you're good under pressure. I lost 3 times last week, strategically lost, Fred said. There's a difference. George thought he was winning. I was winning, George said, from behind Fred. You thought you were winning. Those are the same, they're not. They dispersed into the house, the noise of it rising and branching, and Arthur went to the sitting room and the wireless, and Percy went to the study, and Ginny went upstairs with the quiet purposefulness of someone who had things to do that were her own business, and eventually the kitchen was just Molly and Harry. She was starting to think about dinner. Harry was at the table, and she expected him to ask if he could help, and instead he just got up and went to the cold cupboard and found the onions she'd been planning to use and brought them to the counter without being asked. She looked at him. He shrugged. You do onions first, he said. I've watched you. She handed him a knife. They cooked in the easy quiet of 2 people who'd got used to being in the same kitchen, and outside the window the garden went gold, and the clock ticked, and all 7 hands were home, and the dinner came together the way dinners did in this house, without effort, or rather without felt effort, which was the product of years of practice and of a kitchen that knew what it was supposed to be doing. At some point Harry said, I've been thinking about what you said. About things happening with me. She chopped onions. Have you? I think I've been waiting for someone to tell me what I am, he said. Like there's an official answer somewhere and someone who knows what it is. He paused. But that's the same thing as being in the cupboard. Waiting for the door to open. She looked at him. I think I have to stop waiting for someone to tell me who I am, he said. And just, be it. Whatever it is. She kept chopping. I think that's exactly right, she said. It's harder than it sounds. Most right things are, she said. But you've already started. Have I? You spoke today, she said. In that room, in front of those board members, with Rose sitting there. You said what was true and you said what you wanted and you didn't apologize for either. He was quiet. I was scared, he said. I know, she said. Didn't stop you. He absorbed that. She let it sit and stayed in the chopping. Molly, he said. She looked up. He was standing at the counter with an onion in one hand, and he looked at her with the expression she'd been watching unfold over 2 weeks, open, uncertain, but standing in the uncertainty without trying to close back up. Like someone learning that the open air wasn't always dangerous. I know I'm not, technically I'm not, he stopped. Tried again. The guardianship isn't formal yet. No, she said. That will take a few more weeks. But the clock, he said. It's already, yes, she said. The clock already knows. He looked at her. Then, with the careful deliberateness of someone choosing to do something they'd been thinking about for a while, what do I call you? The kitchen was very warm. The onions were done. The dinner was underway. The clock ticked behind her with 7 hands and no uncertainty whatsoever. She put down the knife. She looked at Harry Potter, 12 years old, Hogwarts robes, untamable hair, the very particular, very specific look of someone standing at the edge of something and deciding to step forward, and she thought about what she wanted to say and whether she had the right to say it and what it would mean if she said it, and then she thought, of course I have the right. I went to Surrey with a warrant and brought him home. I painted his name on my clock before the outcome was certain. I sat with him at midnight and wrote down everything he'd been carrying and turned it into ammunition on his behalf. If that's not the right, I don't know what is. Mum, she said. If you want. He looked at the floor. Then he looked at her. Something moved across his face that was too big and too quiet for the kitchen, for the onions, for the completely ordinary Thursday evening, and maybe that was exactly the point, that the biggest things happened in the most ordinary moments, in kitchens with bad lighting and dinner in progress. He nodded. Once, slowly. Okay, he said. Not it's fine. Not the reflexive, defended okay that meant I have accepted this situation. The okay of someone who meant it from the ground up. She picked up the knife again. Pass me the carrots. He passed her the carrots. They finished making dinner, and the house went on being the house, and outside the window the Devon evening came down in its unhurried way, and inside the clock ticked and 7 hands pointed home, and not one of them was going anywhere. 6 weeks later, the formal guardianship papers arrived. Percy brought them in from the post at breakfast and set them in front of Molly with both hands and a look on his face that was trying very hard to be his normal look and was not succeeding at all. Arthur reached across and gripped her hand on the table without looking up from the papers. Harry was eating toast. He watched Percy put the documents down. He watched Molly read them. He watched Arthur's face. Molly looked up. She slid the papers to Harry. He read them. His name was on them 7 times, in the clean official language of a ministry document that had been filed and reviewed and stamped with the board seal, his full name, his date of birth, the declaration of formal guardianship, the terms and rights and responsibilities of it laid out in Percy's thorough, precise legal language. He read all of it. He put the papers flat on the table. The Burrow was doing its morning thing, someone upstairs moving around, the wireless not yet on, the smell of toast and tea and the low fire in the kitchen. An entirely ordinary Thursday morning, except for the papers on the table. He looked up. Ron was watching him from across the table with a barely contained expression. Fred had his chin in his hand, looking at Harry over the top of it. George was very still. Ginny was watching him the way she always watched him, with that clear, attentive look that didn't miss things. So, Fred said finally, unable to maintain silence any longer. "You're stuck with us." Harry looked at him. "Permanently," George added. "Official," Fred confirmed. "Legally binding," Percy said, from behind his mug. "No returns," Ron said. Harry looked at all of them, around the table in sequence, Fred, George, Ron, Ginny, Percy, Arthur, and then he looked at Molly, who was sitting with her hands around her tea and her whole heart in her face and not doing anything about either. "Yeah," he said. And he smiled, and picked up his toast, and the morning went on.